We're hosting two panels today. During our first panel, we'll be hearing from the Climate Change Committee, and during our second panel, we'll be hearing from the Minister and the Office of Zero Emission Vehicles. So please could I ask our panel to introduce themselves?
Good morning, Chair. My name is Nigel Topping. I'm the Chair of the Climate Change Committee.
Good morning, Chair. My name is Eoin Devane. I'm Head of Carbon Budgets in the Secretariat for the committee.
Welcome, welcome. So how confident are you in your assessment that the EV transition will outpace both the SMMT, motor manufacturers' projection, and the government's ZEV mandate?
I'd say we stand behind our modelling. I mean, a lot of our modelling is requires us to be very thoughtful about the nature of the development of costs in new technologies. And in the case of EVs, of course, as you know, for a low-level subcompact car, 30 to 40% of the price is based on the cost of batteries. So we follow the battery price evolution very, very carefully, and we see battery price evolving pretty much in the way that we'd expect. I might ask Eoin, who actually does the modelling, to say a bit more about how we model that. But just a couple of snapshots. I mean, you'll all have seen the headline in Auto Trader last week about price parity being reached on average, and of course another energy price shock which puts up the cost of petrol further tips the consumer economic case in the favour of a transition. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. The longer this goes on, we expect the more there's going to be an acceleration in adoption. So we're pretty confident that the basic logic of that learning effect driving down the cost of batteries flowing through into the price of electric vehicles, and of course a much bigger range now available. Particularly, what started off as very much a high-end only transition now with models available across the whole range. But Eoin, maybe say something.
Anything to add?
Yeah, so I'll give a bit of addition on how we approached our modelling and how we came to those projections. So first of all, we started by looking at how costs of new technologies tend to evolve. And if you look at most new technologies historically and currently, their prices follow S-curves, so they sort of decrease slowly at first and then quite rapidly as the market matures. And so if you look at that from that perspective, at the prices we've seen in EVs since around 2010, you see very much that dynamic being followed, relatively slow reductions, and now we're very much quite clearly at the point of kind of quite rapid reductions, as Nigel says, due to rapid reductions in battery prices, currently at their lowest price ever, due also to manufacturers committing to the EV transition and building their supply chains, offering that range of new models, etc. So we're at that kind of steep point on the transition. We use that along with other data on the running cost savings that EVs offer, because for almost all households, certainly for households that can charge at home, there are significant savings to be had running an EV compared to a petrol car. We also look at things like charging infrastructure, where we've seen big levels of growth in charging infrastructure, about 4 times the number of charge points available in public locations today than there were 5 years ago. We put all of that into a consumer choice model, which models the sort of behaviour you might expect to see based on those factors. And we calibrate that model based on the behaviours we've seen in the market to date. And that gives us confidence that we'll hit that sort of price parity point between around this year for the largest cars through to about 2028 for the smallest cars. And that puts us on the cusp of, we believe, a tipping point where the EV becomes the natural choice for someone buying a new car. And that gives us confidence that we will begin to accelerate beyond the ZEV mandate.
Okay, thank you. So obviously government action or inaction is crucial to the surface transport sector decarbonising in the UK economy, and it's such a big sector. It's such a crucial policy area. So would any further flexibilities in the ZEV mandate put the government's climate targets at risk?
As you say, Chair, road transport is a very important sector of the economy in terms of decarbonisation. It's actually it's the single biggest sector in terms of emissions, I think 24%, whereas the power sector is the sixth biggest. So it's, often when we talk about decarbonising the economy, there's an attention on power, but this sector that we're talking about today is now the biggest and most important. I think from our perspective, consistency of policy signalling to the market is really crucial when we're going through such a big change and so many people are having to invest. The charging infrastructure companies are having to invest. A lot of the destinations, the big offices or supermarkets are having to invest, and they're investing on the basis of an expectation that the policy continues. I think so. From that point of view, considering a dilution of the ambition would risk slowing down. I think it's also worth. Two other reflections. One, we know that hybrid electric vehicles don't achieve the emission savings that they state on the tin. So there's a real risk that diluting more towards hybrids slows down the decarbonisation beyond the levels that we need to, and jeopardises hitting some of the legal targets. We also interestingly know that the majority of hybrids are actually more expensive than their counterparts, which is not surprising really, because it's not really a hybrid. It's a twin drivetrain option. You're having to pay for both. So obviously they're more complicated to build and to maintain. I think also, I spent the first half of my career working in the automotive sector, and there's a fine balance to be found between having the policy environment which makes the UK a good place to invest in manufacturing electric cars, and going too fast and putting the costs up, and too slow and losing to the competition. So it feels like we're kind of in the sweet spot now, where the market is naturally developing as costs come down with the support of the mandate. So I think we might think that claims that we're going too fast are maybe a little bit overstated. So stay the course would be our recommendation.
That's helpful. And in your 2025 report, you recommended measures to increase public awareness of the benefits of EVs. Is the government's Get That Electric Feeling campaign sufficient, or is further work needed in this area, or are there other things that are key to buyers or potential buyers choosing to switch from an ICE vehicle to an electric vehicle?
Well, we did make the recommendation. We're pleased to see the government moving on in the public awareness campaign, because of course, as always, we're still in the relatively early stage. I mean, although we're about a quarter of the new sales, I know it was a third in December, but still the vast majority of the fleet, the vast majority of the cars that people are driving are combustion engine cars. So still a very small proportion of the fleet of consumers and fleet owners have a lived experience of an electric vehicle. So there's still lots of misunderstanding. So I think it's really welcome. Of course, market growth in itself increases the number of people who have a neighbour or a friend or a colleague who have an electric vehicle. So that word of mouth is really important. And as Eoin mentioned, I think the continued growth of off-street parking. I mean, we know that a lot of the local authorities have recently concluded RFP processes and awarded contracts for significant installation of curbside parking, which obviously addresses one of the challenges right now of people who don't have off-street parking themselves. So I think it's one to watch, because these sort of consumer transitions are very, very difficult to predict. So good that the government's leaning in to make awareness, but there are other factors as well. I don't know if there's anything else.
Yeah, just the modelling I described gives us confidence that it is possible to see this tipping point happen quite quickly, but it does critically depend on consumers having confidence in making that switch. And so, from what the surveys we've seen, the concerns people have lie around cost. So it's really good to see a lot of the focus of the campaign being on the fact that costs have fallen a lot more than maybe people quite realise, and in particular that if you have a driveway in particular, you have the ability to save hundreds of pounds from the get-go compared to the cost of fueling your petrol car. But there are also concerns around battery range, battery health, and charging, as Nigel described. So interventions to particularly reduce the cost of public charging, where people have to rely on it, are very important. We're pleased to see the government commit to looking into ways to do that, and we're pleased to see the intervention on pavement gullies last week, I think it was. But there could be more to do around giving people confidence in the health of a battery, for instance. There's been talk of battery health certification schemes and things like that would be helpful to the majority of people who buy their vehicles not on the new market but on the used market.
Thank you. So one of our witnesses said that it feels, in terms of policy interventions in this area, that the government has one foot on the accelerator and the other foot on the brake. In terms of good examples of transition in other countries, are there policy interventions from other countries, particularly Europe, that we could learn from?
So we haven't done a detailed review of different policy options abroad. I'm aware of, in France, they've looked at sort of social leasing schemes. I talked about the used market. They have value in supporting people to get used cars, enabling them to get used cars, maybe with low interest loans and things like that, which in turn has value in supporting residual values for people who buy their cars new on leasehold and things like that. There are, I think, there's obviously a range of other types of policies in terms of incentives. We have the EV grant which came in, which I think the witness you were talking about was referring to as the kind of accelerator piece versus the vehicle excise duty being the brake piece. A lot of other countries have seen success with grants as well, but also with sort of maybe softer incentives in terms of priority for lower rates for parking, lower rates for tolls, etc. I think a lot of Scandinavian countries have looked at those sorts of schemes, but as I said, we haven't done a detailed assessment of their value.
I think, Chair, if I might add one interesting observation from a conversation with some Chinese counterparts who provide the advice to the Chinese government on the transition, is that we're actually in a much better position with regard to the flexibility of our electricity market and the ability for retail time of use tariffs to be made available. And I think one thing and that's perhaps an advantage which part of the transition to an electrified future, which once people understand could significantly increase their incentive. Because this ability, when you start to electrify, to move.
When you say flexibility, do you mean of time of day?
Yes, time of use tariff. So when you can buy electricity for 5p overnight, which if you have a combustion engine car, there's not much use to you, because there's not much you can do between two.
Again, that's fine if you've got domestic charging, but unless we get some kind of battery technology, that's not going to be applicable in public parking.
Well, interestingly, if you speak to the public charging providers, some of them are now starting to invest in small batteries. If you're drilling a hole in the ground to put in your curbside parking, it doesn't cost you much extra to make the hole a little bit bigger and put a battery in, and then you can start to offer better rates overnight, because you can start to use that battery to some of the pricing arbitrage that's available. So I think it's something to watch. So yes, the capability is already there for domestic, but it looks like the charging providers, because the charging providers are starting to realise that they're really competing with domestic charging for those who have domestic, so they've got to be able to do something to try and bring that tariff down.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca.
Thank you. Hi. I think just listening to what you've been saying, there's a couple of things it highlights that then lead into the question I want to ask. I mean, effectively, you're describing a postcode lottery at the moment on whether you're near somewhere that has off-road parking that you can charge, whether your local authority is invested in large-scale charging areas or not, whether they're doing the gullies, whether they're doing, if you've got somebody that's just invested in a charge point on a pavement that doesn't have that battery technology, you're going to have to wait until they replace those charging points. And I think that highlights the differential you've got between some big urban centres and then other areas in the country that perhaps haven't had that same level of investment. Perhaps the residential areas don't lend themselves to it in the same way. Plus the big question of that differential between urban and rural areas. So obviously your modelling shows the trajectory going in the way you want it, but how reflective is that of different regions in the country, different differentials between urban and rural areas, and what can you say to the public about that postcode lottery bit? Because whilst it's great that the trajectory is going in the right direction, people's lived experience of that is perhaps going to be different, which I think then also plays in to their confidence levels.
Yeah, you're right that distribution of charging devices is very uneven at the moment. It's something we've flagged in our progress reports for the last couple of years. It's worth noting, though, there's also an uneven distribution in the level of off-street charging. So one of the challenges you might face in more urban areas is that more homes are flats or terraced houses that don't have the ability to charge domestically, which at the moment that is the big win, is if you have a driveway, you have the ability to plug in, you can charge, as Nigel said, sometimes overnight for very little or even no money at times. You're making significant savings. But we are very keen to see that extended to people who don't have that ability. And so running gullies across pavements, it's a good news story, I think, in terms of being able to do that without getting planning permission. But I don't think it's the only thing. It won't work for a lot of people. If you can't park your car straight outside your house, it's not going to work for you. So we definitely need to look into more ways to, as Nigel said, those sorts of innovative solutions with chargers on lampposts and things like that connected to batteries that can bring those costs down. There is very good practice in lots of different local authorities, but you're right, it's patchy at the moment. And so I think we need to try and learn from what's working well in places that are doing better.
Is that geographical patchiness partly to do with market confidence, and in other countries, is there more state intervention in ensuring a more even geographic spread of public charging?
I don't know on the state intervention point, I'm afraid, but you're right, market confidence is key. And one of the, circling back to the ZEV mandate, one of the things the ZEV mandate is really good for is giving private businesses who want to invest in charging infrastructure the confidence in the level of demand they will see. And I'm sure they have detailed models based on the national level mandate targets of what that might expect to look like at different rural, urban geographies and different scales. But at an aggregate level, at least, it gives them confidence that they can expect to see this level of demand for their service.
Thank you.
I think it is. It's something to watch. Right? As I said, there's a lot of local authorities now rolling out, and interestingly, I think Uber is an interesting source of information. I don't know if you've spoken to them, because their drivers are predominantly from lower income urban areas that historically have been charging desert. So they've been very active in advocating for and working with some of the charging companies to try and address that. Of course, and I think it might be worth just drawing a parallel and pointing out the differences between another important piece of infrastructure, which is broadband or fibre. Because, of course, the left to its own devices, the market will look for where it thinks it can get maximum utilisation. So or biggest bang for its buck. So in broadband, it will go urban, right? A fibre cable that can go past thousands of houses is going to be more profitable than one that goes to one house at the end of a country lane, which is why the government, in that case, has had to intervene to create the conditions that make sure that rural infrastructure is invested in, because it's
sometimes it does, yeah.
Sometimes, but there's clearly an attempt to do that, right? I think it's slightly different in that the lack of roadside off-road parking is much more an urban phenomenon. So there's actually, in that sense, there's a better match between what the market would like to do and the problem. And I think
but there are lots of destinations away from urban areas which do affect people's range confidence. Rebecca, you wanted to come back?
Well, yeah, the question I asked was, does your modelling account for those regional differences? Like, I appreciate that it's great that local authorities are doing things. We know that because we've had them come in, we've all got experiences of that. The key question I was asking was around your data and the mapping you've got. Does your data take into account regional disparity, or is it aggregated across the entire country? Because if it doesn't, I don't think it's serving us as well as it perhaps could, because it doesn't highlight the rate of change in other places. So if that's not something you do, is that something you might be able to start doing to further the cause of developing this?
So it does in part, in terms of trying to model where you might need more or less charging provision, but we don't have the full data to do a full model of uptake by postcode area or local authority area.
Even region, do you have it for the southwest, for the southeast, for the north?
Currently not, but it's
I think
something.
Auto Trader might in terms of...
not in terms of policy setting.
No, not in terms of policy.
Not
No,
forward
but
looking, I think.
yeah, but that's useful, thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, if there's no more questions on the sort of overarching area, we'll go on to vans and trucks.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, starting with vans then. Electric vans are only selling at around half the rate required to meet the original ZEV mandate targets. About 9.1% of new registrations, I think, last year were electric. What's the biggest barrier to electric van adoption, and is a new policy required to accelerate take-up?
Yeah, so we're having a bit of a look at this, because you're right, it is a market that's certainly starting from a lower base, but we have confidence there is still time to make up the ground. But interestingly, if you look at that modelling I described, you would expect purely economically for the market to be going more quickly. So it does appear to be the sort of non-financial side of things that are the big barriers. The government commissioned a survey a couple of years ago of van users and operators, and they found a range of barriers, but the biggest ones seem to be, firstly, kind of understanding and confidence in the vehicle. So either understanding how you operate an EV, or understanding how, or having confidence in how it might be used for their business. Concerns about range of the vehicles, whether they've got enough range to not have to stop and recharge during the day, during a full working day, for instance. And then concerns about charging, which came from two perspectives. One was simply for vehicles that aren't charged at a depot, they would either have to be charged at a driver's home, which might not be possible if they don't have a driveway, or might not be desirable, or would have to be charged on the public network, which comes back to the same problems about cost of charging that we've discussed earlier, but also there are added problems for vans, and that some charge points might not be designed to have quite the same space that a van requires, or if you're running a busy business, you might be a bit concerned about risking needing to queue for a charge point, for instance. And then finally, businesses that do operate depots have seen issues, and this applies for HGVs as well, getting grid connections to have 10 chargers in their depot, either the cost of that or the priority of that. Those were the issues that were raised 2 or 3 years ago. I think you've had evidence given from fleet operators who have said some of the same things, I think, earlier in this inquiry, but we're very keen on the committee to figure out whether the interventions the government has taken in this area, such as the workplace charging scheme and the depot charging scheme, are helping to mitigate that, and also whether the fact that there are now a lot more models on the market than there were 2 or 3 years ago is helping alleviate concerns about range or confidence in the technology. So it's one of our priorities on the committee for the next sort of 6 to 8 months to try and speak to some fleet operators, van owners, etc., to understand whether there is progress being made towards resolving those barriers.
Thank you.
And I'd say that of course, the 36% growth year to year in uptake is encouraging, but I think, as Eoin says, we're keen to make sure we understand whether that's sort of the beginning of sustained exponential growth, or whether there are still, as Eoin says, those non-financial barriers that persist. But we should remember that although it's below target, it has started to show the beginnings of that exponential growth that we'd expect.
Okay, moving to HGVs then, the government's launched a consultation on the new regulatory framework for HGVs, and plans to publish 2 new strategies, the coach infrastructure strategy and zero emission HGV strategy. What, in your view, what measures need to be included in these strategies to make them work?
So even earlier stage for the HGV market, but I think quite promising signs. Lots of manufacturers moving into this space. In the last 5 years since we gave our advice on the sixth carbon budget, I think the technology options have narrowed in this space, and it's become a lot clearer that electric is likely to be the solution for the majority of operations. So that's really positive news. We welcome the government's consultation in this space. I think it's important to try and give confidence and certainty to that market. And in fact, the consultation reaffirms the commitment to phase out the sale of new non-zero emission HGVs by 2035 for vehicles under 26 tonnes and by 2040 for all new non-zero emission HGVs. I think there's two strands to what they're proposing. One is an infrastructure strategy, which is really important because I touched on it earlier. Grid connections, both cost and the timeliness of getting those are going to be crucial for operators, but also the ability to kind of share grid connections, use shared charging in places where you're dropping things off is going to be critical and is not something that is currently always happening. But also then there's the question of the regulation, and I think they've proposed 3 potential approaches. One is CO2 emissions targets, essentially extending what we currently have. The second is something akin to a ZEV mandate, and the third is fleet adoption requirements. We haven't assessed the kind of relative benefits of each of them, but we do think the ZEV mandate for cars is working very well. I wanted to point out earlier that despite the kind of claims to the contrary, we should note that the ZEV mandate for cars was achieved last year by all manufacturers without paying fines within the flexibilities allowed. So it is working well and is prompting growth of that market. And so we feel that would be the most reliable way of stimulating growth in that zero emission market.
Okay, thank you. Alex?
In your answer then, it was about HGV vehicles. The strategy is also about coaches. I know the coach sector feel quite often they're part of the bus and coach, and now they're part of HGV and coach in this. Is there any specific remarks you might have about the coach industry?
I'll take that. I think Eoin referred earlier to in the HGV sector, for a long time there's been a question about, is this going to be fuel cell or is it going to be battery? And that's common in the early stage of a transition, right? That there's competition between. I mean, some of you may be old enough to remember the VHS Betamax thing when videos came, that there were 2 competing technologies and then one, and we tend to get this technology lock-in. And until very recently, it's been unclear with heavy goods vehicles. In China now, which leads technologically in so many cases, over 50% of heavy goods vehicles being sold are electrified, so we can be pretty confident that the technology is locking into electric vehicles. In coaches, it seems to have got there earlier. I mean, you'll be aware that we're at nearly 40% by sales of buses and coaches in the UK, and all the major coach operators have committed to zero carbon fleets. So it feels like that is the evidence is that is a sector which is more comfortable with the transition already. They tend, of course, to have more repeatability of routes. By definition, but I think it's interesting that the 3 biggest operators have all committed to being 100% electric by 2030 or 2035 and are well on the way to do that.
Just about repeated routes, I absolutely get that for the bus sector. They are working to a timetable, but for the coach sector particularly, I mean, quite often coaches do many different things, excursions, maybe going to completely different places, that one day they might be a bus replacement service, it isn't necessarily to a standardised timetable.
No, so I think that's a good distinction to make. I was thinking of the National Express stagecoach coaches, which run long distance, and I forget the name of there's a Scottish electric only coach company that's launched recently. So I think that you're right. There's a subsector which is where the charging infrastructure is more of and confidence that wherever you're delivering your tour party, so that you would expect to transition slower than the more predictable one. Yeah.
think note your observation that it's HGV and coach, but I think it is important it is and coach, because if it were just HGV, it would be missing that consideration of how that infrastructure works for coach fleets as well.
With a very different destination profile.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hey, thank you very much. And now moving on to Ollie.
Right, I thought I had question 4, but...
Sorry? Oh, Scott, sorry, I do apologise. Scott, you wanted to come in at this point. You're absolutely right.
We're easily confused, Chair. We're easily confused. Eoin, you suggested we should...
Oh, sorry, yeah. What? Okay.
You suggested we should rejoice that the ZEV mandate was met last year, but am I right in understanding that the reason it was met is manufacturers bought lots of credits from manufacturers, and so people like Elon Musk and Chinese manufacturers have benefited from this substantially?
It was met through the way it was designed, which is trading within the market, and you're right that Tesla, for instance, by default effectively have a 100% BEV share and are achieving more sales,
and people are buying credits from Tesla.
But that does still mean that there are that number of electric vehicles entering the fleet, and it's not just Tesla and the Chinese companies. We've seen a lot of the major European manufacturers make strong progress. I think Renault are at 29% battery electric vehicle sales. The major German manufacturers are all somewhere around 20%, low 20s. So there is progress, I think, across the whole market.
Okay, interesting. So of course, what we're really talking about is reducing transport-related emissions. And many of our towns and cities are congested. If we replace all those cars with electric vehicles, our towns and cities are still going to be congested. Should we not be talking more about getting people out of cars and onto walking, hopefully not tripping over cables on the footpath, cycling, or perhaps even using the bus? If the focus is actually reducing transport emissions,
we should do both. I agree. If you look at our analysis, our pathway includes both a transition to electric vehicles and a transition to more walking, cycling, bus use. I would note, though, it is challenging to deliver sustained modal shift, and the evidence is slightly patchy. And so we looked at a review of interventions that have worked in cities, towns across Great Britain, but also across Europe. And we really tried to do that to focus not on theoretical ideas of what might be possible, but on practical solutions of what is possible. And that led us to the conclusion that about 7% of car kilometres could be shifted onto those alternative modes by 2035, which might not sound like a lot, but you should remember that mostly the trips you're shifting are going to be shorter trips, mostly in urban centres. And so that is quite, in my view, quite an ambitious target. It would bring us more in line with some of the leading countries in Europe. So if you look in 2022, which was the latest evidence we had at the time, public transport share in England was about 14% of distance travelled. In Germany and Switzerland, it's more like 19 or 20%. If you look at active travel, it was about 5% in England. In Netherlands, the leading player in this field, it's 11%. So I'm not suggesting we can get all the way there, but there's definitely scope to go further.
In terms of the use of public money, we're investing all this money in electric car grants and other things, and a lot of that money is just going straight to the wealthiest people in society. Would that money not be better spent on modal shift, which benefits a kind of wider range of people in our country?
But again, I come back to it's both, right? And I would say the grant's going to incentivise electric vehicle purchase, get vehicles into the fleets. Most people don't buy their vehicles new; they buy their vehicles either second-hand 2 or 3 years down the line when a fleet sells them, or they buy them third, fourth hand. And the more electric vehicles we can get into the stock today, the earlier those become available across society. But yeah, I think we need to see both. That you made the point, there's a lot of non-emissions related benefits to active travel in particular, but also public transport. We made that point in our advice. Our advice has a lot more of this than the government's pathway relies on. So we would want to see more more use of the potential for modal shift towards the emissions plans than currently seen. But the big ticket is still EVs. Like that 7% is about the equivalent of getting about 2.5 million EVs into the fleet, which sounds like a lot, but it's about the number of EVs we'll be selling each year by 2030. So it's not something that can be used instead of the EV transition, but it should be alongside.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
So just on that, in the context of a projection, a forecast that the government is working to, and we were heard from Highways England last week, a projected increase of vehicle mileage in this country of 10% over the next 5 years. Are your projections on transport emissions taking that into account? They are.
It's a really important question. Ours are relative to the level of baseline growth. I think our assumption on baseline growth is slightly lower than the government's, particularly on the van side of things, but they do start from that growing baseline.
Right, so surely... Okay, so a 7%... So you're saying 7% of car mileage in this country could be shifted to active travel and public transport. I don't know to what extent that's in your advice, but that would still mean that we'd still have that, you know, if the 10% projection is what is going to happen, because there's no policy interventions that are changing that of any significance that we can see. So that's still an increase in overall congestion on our roads on that basis.
I think our pathway would be roughly flat in terms of actual aggregate kilometres, but that's in the context of a growing population and potentially a growing level of car ownership as well. It is in our advice to answer your other question, that 7%.
Right, thank you. If no one else has got any other questions for our colleagues from the Climate Change Committee? Oh, yes, go on, Scott.
Vans, can I just very briefly on vans? So vans are a huge challenge, as you've highlighted. But one of the issues, I spoke to a retailer last week that was saying he just couldn't sell second-hand vans, and he put his vans on Auto Trader at the lowest possible price, below everybody else, and still after a month they had no interest in those vans. You spoke earlier about what the French government's doing in terms of trying to prop up the second-hand market. Do you think the government should be doing more to support people who need vans, particularly in that second-hand market? Because a lot of our small independent businesses, they thrive on the second-hand van market, don't they? And if electric vehicles aren't attractive to them, that's a real challenge.
It's a very good question. As I said, we're keen to get more into the van market this year. I think definitely we're aware of there's a level of instability and residual values on both cars and vans in the used market, which feeds through to uncertainty, higher lease costs, etc., for people buying those vehicles up front. To some extent, that's a feature of a growing market with prices falling, but certainly we want to see a market where people have confidence both in buying the new vehicle that they'll be able to sell it at the end of its life, but also in buying that second, third, fourth hand van to use for small businesses.
But I mean, I know it's only an anecdote, but it may. But those are important as to generate hypotheses of what might not be working. But I remember when London started introducing charging, there were a lot of those small traders wanted to buy electric vans. This is like 7 or 8 years ago, but there weren't. But then they found that they couldn't buy them for love nor money. So it's like, okay, you're penalising us, but we can't. There's no way of getting out of jail. So there was a need then for the that triggered some of the main van manufacturers to start developing UK-based models and selling them in here. So I think your anecdote suggested that it's not the economics, but it's something infrastructural, right? Because if you can't sell it even at a very low price, then it means that somebody doesn't. Normally you'd expect that the market to clear at a low price. So that goes back to the point about needing to understand what the infrastructural challenges are.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it is an anecdote, but I think there's just the general issues we know about load, range, reliability, etc. There's similar issues we have with cars, but I guess I'm not really in the mindset of a van driver or owner, but I think it's a real challenge if we want broader acceptance right across the economy.
A lot of the...
Sorry.
Yeah, so I'm just conscious the Minister is waiting, and I've got just one other question. Much of your advice on policy interventions have been around carrots, and that's where a lot of the policy interventions are. Do you think there's a role for more sticks as well as a balance in terms of supporting the shift of people into and buyers into EVs?
Generally speaking, we're quite policy neutral. We're advising on technology pathways and saying that there needs to be a policy environment to set that. We're very pro the creation of market mechanisms which drive a transition automatically, but those can, as you say, be a combination of sticks and carrots, and both are valid, and getting the balance right is really a matter for the policymakers. Okay, thank you very much for your time, and that concludes our first panel. Thank you for the evidence, and if there's anything else you want to add, do send us in writing. So I'm going to suspend the meeting for a few moments while our next witnesses take their places. The sitting is suspended. Order. Welcome to our second panel today, and I apologise, I should have done this earlier, but I'd like to welcome John Whitby, who's joining us today, guesting from the Environmental Audit Committee. So, could I please ask you both to introduce yourselves?
Yes, good morning, Chair and committee members. I'm Keir and I'm the Minister for Aviation, Maritime and Decarbonisation at the Department for Transport.
And I'm Richard Bruce. I'm Director of the Office for Emission Vehicles, which is a joint unit between DFT and DESNES, which I do jointly with Caroline Lowe.
So, welcome, and we'll now go on to the first question, which is Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. Fairly simple opening question, or the answer may not be. How confident are you that the electric vehicle transition is happening at the pace required?
Well, thank you very much for that question. The short answer, which I'll then go into in more detail, is we are confident that it is moving at the pace required, but that doesn't mean that there isn't enormous work to do. And I'm certainly under no illusion as Minister about what the scale of the challenge is. The UK currently has got the highest EV share of any major European market in 2025. We're ahead of Germany and France. This past March was the highest sales month ever for EVs in the UK, and the electric car grant, which the government has been running, has surpassed 100,000 orders since July. There are now 119,000 public chargers across the UK, which is more than the number of fuel pumps, and almost 1 million homes in England have access to their own chargers, which allows people to benefit from charging for as little as 2p a mile. There is an enormous amount of private and public investment into the EV transition, £6 billion in the charge point sector to ensure that people can charge wherever they are in the United Kingdom. The automotive sector, whether that be manufacturers or people selling or leasing vehicles, have put an enormous amount of money into the transition because they understand the direction of travel and they are as ambitious about it as the government is. However, though I think it's right that we sort of celebrate the progress that we've made, I am very cognizant of the fact that the government is trying to bring forward phase-out dates which are ambitious. We want to be leading in making the switch to EVs. We think that this is sort of an ambition that car manufacturers share, but we are very much kind of putting our money where our mouth is. We're investing £7.5 billion out to 2035 to support those key areas of the transition, whether that be charge point rollout, the cost of buying your first vehicle, or the ability to charge from home. But my sort of number one message for the committee today is that the government is fully committed to the EV transition. We think EVs are critical to our future. They underpin industrial growth in the automotive sector. They bring real cost benefits to consumers and people who are able to benefit from them. In the current geopolitical climate that we face, they bring real resilience benefits, and also they bring enormous health benefits as well in terms of easing congestion and air pollution for the people that we seek to represent. The government's committed to making sure that that transition is equitable and works for as many people as possible. But despite the challenges that we face, I do believe we're on the right track.
Okay, so just to be clear, do you believe the 2030 phase-out date is realistic?
Yes. That's not to say that there aren't challenges in meeting it. I think, debate is ongoing within the automotive sector, and I was at SMMT Electrified a few weeks ago and got some robust questions on exactly this point. I don't think the principle of the 2030 phase-out date is something that people are doubting within the automotive sector. In fact, it actually serves as the sort of North Star for investor certainty, which underpins the entirety of the transition. The 2030 requirement itself, obviously, is that all new cars are either zero emission or they're hybridised, and we've seen that full hybrids are up 6.2%, plug-in hybrids are up 46.5% so far this year, with petrol being down 3.5% and diesel 9.8%, and these are trends that we expect to continue out to 2030, and that correlates obviously very closely with the ZEV mandate. That's the strongest demand signal that you can send, and as your previous witnesses shared in terms of meeting the 2024 obligations, the automotive sector was able to do that using the flexibilities which are part of the design of the scheme. And data shows that 2025 is also looking promising in terms of compliance as well. So in that context, yes, I do believe the 2030 phase-out date is realistic.
Okay, so I hear what you're saying about the manufacturing sector, but we're hearing through this inquiry that there's big concerns about the delivery of charging infrastructure, grid readiness, and indeed affordability, and they're all lagging behind where we would need to be to achieve that trajectory to get to 2030. So would you agree with those concerns, or you think it's all going to be fine?
Oh no, well, I certainly don't want to give the impression that everything's fine and we're just going to leave it to kind of evolve as it wishes to. The government is very actively working in partnership with the charge point sector, for instance, to drive this transition, because that is necessary. We're trying to convince the public to give an EV a go and make that switch because of the enormous cost benefits it can bring. But they can only do that if they are reassured around key aspects of vehicle technology, around range, and with the new models that are coming to the fore, we think we've got a fantastic case to make on that front, but also that they're able to access public charging right across the United Kingdom. So as I said in answer to my first question, we've got 119,000 public EV chargers in the UK. That's more than the number of petrol pumps we have. But there are 100,000 more that are expected to be delivered, and that's part of the £400 million Levi Fund that the government is implementing in partnership with local authorities to make sure that we have an equitable spread of charging infrastructure right across the United Kingdom. We're also looking at the fact that charge point access in households is what's going to make the transition not just a reality, but to make good kind of cost sense for consumers so that they can access those lower rates. And the government has got a very ambitious scheme of charge point grants where both landlords, homeowners, those in the private rented sector can access almost half of the cost of installing a charger. So we think we've got a suite of measures that drive that demand. Are there challenges? Yes, and I spend a lot of time meeting with the automotive sector, meeting with the charge point sector about what those challenges are and seeking to address them. I think the number one thing, though, that I'm cognizant of is that the sector and consumers need certainty that the government stands behind the EV transition, wants to see it realised in short order and is ambitious about it, because those timelines that the automotive sector are working to are long, and they are kind of fundamental to how the automotive sector runs in the United Kingdom. So the government can't be sending mixed messages like we saw with the sort of previous Conservative administration, stepping back from the phase-out date altogether. That didn't serve anybody's interests. people deserve consistency and clarity from government in terms of the schemes we're bringing forward and the overall policy direction. I'm confident about what those policies allow us to achieve, but you are also right to say that there are big challenges too, and I'm sure that that'll come to the fore throughout our conversation today.
So just on that point, you quite rightly emphasise the importance of consistency, Minister. But of course, this government has made changes to the ZEV mandate as of April last year. What evidence do you have as to how effectively those changes are working? And does that not somewhat undermine what you're saying about the importance of consistency in policy?
I don't think so, and that's because the government has made changes to ensure that the ZEV mandate does what it's supposed to, which is allowing us to meet our climate obligations whilst also making good business case for the automotive sector. But what hasn't changed is the timelines, and I think that that's the key difference of what you've seen in the contrast between the previous government and this one. In regard to whether the VETS order, we can say, it's had X or Y impact in uptake. As I previously said, the data for 2025 as it stands does look good in terms of compliance with the mandate itself. We monitor data on sales of electric cars, obviously, incredibly closely through OZEV and in DESNZ and the Department for Transport. It's perhaps a little too early to say definitively what the material impact exactly has been of the changes to the flexibilities. But Richard, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add.
Well, a couple of points, I suppose. One is, in the transition, I think it's really important to remember this is a really dynamic marketplace. It's changing literally every couple of months in terms of products coming into it, the price of them. There's now like 40 EVs are under £30,000. That was a dream a few years ago. So it's astonishing how dynamic it is. When we made the changes to the mandate in terms of increased flexibility for manufacturers, that was basically about giving them more options to deliver decarbonisation in the short term, because they're all in different places in their journey. Some of them had lots and lots of EVs on the market, some of them had fewer, some of them had lots of very ambitious plans, but they weren't coming to fruition yet. So basically, it's all about trying to maintain the momentum, making sure the public line was clear that the phase-out dates weren't changing, the headline trajectory wasn't changing. But for individual manufacturers, recognising the fact that some of them had 10 EVs, some of them had one, and giving them more ways of getting to compliance but still cutting carbon. So all the measures that are in there in flexibility terms have got a very small carbon penalty, and we even charge interest if they want to borrow from the future effectively, but they have to cut carbon in their non-ZEV fleet to be able to sell less EVs.
You wanted to pick up on...
I just want to pick up on a couple of things. So obviously the Minister is rightly saying that things are going well, but you've also used the language trying to convince the public that this is something they should do, whilst maintaining that you can get there by 2030. Trying to convince the public doesn't sound like a mechanism that is going to get to where you want to be. You've also highlighted that previous government changed its position. I think they changed their position because they recognised that delivery was going to be difficult, and that's actually why Conservative policy has progressed even further towards taking away that ban on petrol and diesel cars. So in terms of that, trying to convince the public, I just want to bring you back to the comment you made right at the beginning about the rollout of electric vehicle charging points, because I missed it. I missed what you said. So you said that there are now more electric vehicle charging points than there are petrol pumps in the country. You also said that there's 1 million at-home charge points. Does that 1 million at-home charge points get wrapped into that figure that is more than petrol pumps?
No.
So there's more non-home-based charging points now than petrol pumps. Okay, great.
Charge points compared with petrol stations or petrol pumps at petrol stations?
That's a good point.
Pumps. I think I can't remember the exact stat, there's something like around 8,000 or 9,000 petrol stations in the UK. Average number of pumps is, I think, less than 10.
However, how many of those charge points are as quick to charge as it is to fill a tank of petrol?
It's a fair
comment. I mean, there's a difference between filling or charging a car than a van or a HGV, which we'll come on to.
That could be an interesting statistic to come back to us.
And I guess the point is you don't have the ability to fill your car with petrol at home overnight, but you do with electricity.
It takes 5 minutes.
And just for the record, Minister, I think I heard you just say the ZEV mandate is a demand mechanism, when of course it's a supply mechanism.
You do very well to correct me, Chair.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And there's no doubt it's been effective in delivering a large number of EVs in this country, but the last thing we want is car lots full of unsold EVs. So now we're going to move on to the demand side, and I'll go to John.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, electric car grants clearly have driven sales for EVs, but the committee's heard that they've predominantly benefited higher income households, and I think you said a few moments ago you wanted this to be an equitable transition. So how can the government help with lower income households to participate in this transition to EVs?
Well, thank you and welcome to the committee. That's an incredibly important point. Just in regards to what the ECG facilitates and how that allows lower and middle income households to take part in the EV transition, through the ECG, around 100,000 vehicles have been sold. You can have up to £3,750 off the cost of a new electric vehicle. I'm very cognizant of the fact, though, that 80% of car purchases are in the second-hand market. That doesn't mean that these two things are divorced from each other, in the sense that you need a consistent flow of EVs into the market, being sold and then sold on the used market to allow people across the spectrum to benefit from them. So that's one way in which the ECG links to broader questions about the flow of used electric vehicles into the market. That's also why we have warranty requirements of a minimum of 8 years or 100,000 miles on a traction battery, which ensures that if you are getting a used EV, you're getting one which continues to excel in terms of range and reliability. What I would say more broadly is that we are actually seeing positive growth in the used market for EVs. There's a really broad and actually increasing range of quite popular EV models which are now available for under 20 grand, with the average price of a 3 to 5 year old EV around 18 grand. And there's been some interesting data released recently from Auto Trader, which in February of this year showed that EVs are the fastest selling fuel type on their site, with 3 to 5 year old EVs selling the fastest. So I do think you're starting to see that used market grow, which people will be able to benefit from. But ultimately, in my view, the way that you have the equitable transition and you allow everybody to realise the benefits of owning an EV, and primarily among them is the cost benefit, is access to home charging. And that's why the home and workplace grants that the government is implementing are so important. That pretty much halves the cost of installing a charger, and we've upped it from 350 quid to 500 quid. And we're seeing large-scale uptake of that grant. So I think that's the way that you kind of democratise access, and what we're trying to specifically democratise access to is those cheap charging costs, because if you can charge for as little as 2 pence a mile and essentially get from London to Sheffield for a fiver, that's what's going to make an enormous difference to your pocket in the context of all of the instability that we're facing more broadly. We want as many people to be able to benefit from that as possible.
Is there going to be any further support for electric motorbikes?
That's a good question. So the grant for motorcycles isn't being continued for the moment. The government, in my view, has to be extremely conscious of ensuring that we put money into forms of transport decarbonisation which yield the greatest kind of results in terms of decarb benefits. We think in terms of uptake that the market for zero-emission motorcycles is healthy, but we, of course, keep all of these schemes and grants under continuous review.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Baggy.
Thank you. Moving on to EV excise duty. So we've heard that the proposed scheme might be the right policy, but at the wrong time. So is introducing this new cost while trying to encourage more take-up a bit premature?
Well, I think, not sure about you, Baggy, but I think my constituents would argue that there's never a right time to introduce a new tax. But nevertheless, it's unfortunately necessary because the government is determined to make the EV transition a reality. We want to get to a place where EVs are the dominant form of car transport in the United Kingdom. That necessarily means that you have to come up with a means of raising revenue to ensure that the road network is maintained and that the contribution which is currently realised through fuel duty continues to be kind of contributed to the exchequer. That is incredibly important from the perspective of public finances, but also the maintenance of our national infrastructure. I would actually say, we are taking this transition seriously, And that means that in terms of the certainty, the long-term certainty that we provide to both consumers and businesses, it's important that we give them as much lead time as possible to know what the impact of potential changes are. And that's why announcing that the EVED scheme is going to be introduced 2 years prior to implementation actually allows people to see not only the fact that this change is coming, but also to look at the change relative to what they are dealing with at the moment, because EVED is projected to cost around half of what fuel duty currently constitutes. So they'll pay around 3 pence per mile on an EV by 2028. That's half of the current average fuel duty and equivalent to about £20 a month. People need to see that in the context of the fact that still makes owning an EV incredibly cost beneficial if you can access home charging and charge for as little as 2 pence per mile. Alongside the announcement of the scheme as well, it's very important to remember that the announcement of EVED was accompanied by a support package for ZEVs, which includes £1.3 billion more for the ECG and £200 million more investment in charging. And I know that there are some figures going around about potential damage to uptake, but actually, if you factor in the increase in uptake that will come through that unprecedented support package, we believe that is kind of smoothed out. So in terms of it being the right tax at the wrong time, I actually believe giving people long-term certainty about what the direction of travel is, being clear that the EV transition is happening and that we're going to have mechanisms to be able to accommodate that in the lived experience of drivers up and down the country is sensible, it's pragmatic, it's being honest with people, and we just need to reinforce the argument from government that in terms of the scheme as it relates to fuel duty at present, you're still going to be able to run an EV in an incredibly cost-efficient way, which will save you and your family money.
Just add a point on that, if I may. It didn't get all that much coverage relative to the new tax, but it's worth noting that electric vehicles started paying ordinary VED for the first time from April last year, and it didn't have a huge impact. And in order of magnitude terms, it's not that dissimilar to the likely costs of EVED. Didn't have a huge disproportionate impact on EV demand in 2025. So I think we need to distinguish between the headlines and the actual impact on demand. There's lots of other factors driving people towards EVs.
Richard, can you just repeat what it was you mentioned last year?
So ordinary VED.
Ordinary VED, sorry.
Which you pay on every car. EVs are exempt until April last year. And that's about £200 a year.
So, although, of course, high-value EVs aren't exempt from it, they get charged the luxury vehicles.
They did, but the ban was brought down the budget last year as well to recognise it.
So the OBR have estimated, and accounting for the policies which incentivise take-up over the sort of the forecast period for EVED, there'll be a net decrease of 120,000 vehicles. So, how does that affect the department's planning of the transition?
Might let you come in there, Richard.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. If you do a pure economic model and you start saying if we add this much cost, what will it do to the demand for these vehicles, and you assume car purchasers are entirely rational actors, which I argue not always, then you might get a figure like that, and we've done similar modelling. I think an awful lot can change in 2 years, and it all depends on the counterfactual and the relative attractiveness of EVs relative to petrol vehicles, and if it depends what's happening to petrol prices and diesel prices and the cost of new vehicles. So given the information they had, we can understand that might be the figure the OBR came up with, but we think it might look a lot different in 2 years' time.
You say you've done some modelling. What figures come out of that?
We've done modelling all the way through. Treasury have done their own modelling. It's a Treasury policy, so you need to talk to them, I think. What was the figures from your modelling then? I haven't got them to hand.
I could say though, Baggy, in terms of the OBR's figures, so they've said they expect 320,000 of the 440,000 of EV sales impact that they said would be caused by the introduction of EVED to be offset by the measures that were announced at the budget in 2025. I think you combine that with the suite of measures that we are kind of bringing forward to incentivise EV uptake, and suddenly that picture looks quite different from some of the catastrophising that we might have seen in the broadsheet media after the budget.
If you want to come in.
So I get the sort of the price comparison is coming down, I think, and if it was just a case of existing EV drivers sort of accepting the long-term truth that you've announced, I think it would be fine. But I'm not sure you've priced in the convenience factor into this sort of rejection of the modelling. And I would perhaps I wouldn't suggest you're being bullied by the Treasury into generating revenue. That would be extreme and inappropriate. But if it's still not clear whether the person who's on the cusp of making the transition is going to be able to solve the really practical problem of charging, then the intermediate inconvenience they're going to face still needs every incentive to make it still worthwhile. So it's not straightforward, EV as it is, EV with EVED, comparisons. It's the adoption impact that I think this committee is most concerned about. Surely you're most concerned about the adoption impact. Are you really that confident that somehow that money for the charging infrastructure is going to solve the convenience problems? I think it needs to, if you're going to stand by the claim that it's not going to impact on uptake.
It's a totally fair question. To facilitate the transition isn't just about kind of one piece of the puzzle about getting. You need to get the charging infrastructure right. You also need the incentives on the overall price point of the electric vehicle. There is a much broader conversation, which I won't preempt because I presume we may turn to it later, about the cost of public charging, and we're undertaking a review to facilitate policy options in that space. I do think it's fair to say that, for a consumer who might be on the precipice of making the transition, they're not on the precipice of paying EVED, which comes forward in 2028.
But they need every incentive possible, don't they? If I'm still going to have to walk down my street to get to my car, or drive and turn up and play, an even more extreme version of chicken with other drivers to find a parking space, I need every incentive that's possible to make the transition still. So I accept it's not a tax I'm yet paying, but isn't it something that you need to be able to offer me as a mitigation of the inconvenience?
Yeah, I mean, particularly in the context that the early adopters are people who get the importance of net zero. The next group of adopters, something like potentially 50% of the middle income earners in this country, and people who wouldn't be transitioning to EV for idealistic reasons, but for purely practical reasons, surely the government needs to do everything possible to get those people over the line and not put barriers in their way. It's another way of asking the important question that Steph is asking.
I agree completely. And I think that's why, we are taking a very diverse suite of policy measures in hand immediately to be able to facilitate that.
But this is specifically, sorry to interrupt you, this is specifically about EVED and the impact on uptake. So, surely you wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't for the revenue requirement. You could do this 2 years later and admirably advertise it coming 2 years in advance, but still do it 2 years later. It could still be the right tax at the wrong time.
Well, it's an interesting counterfactual because I think if opposition MPs and other people in the kind of the broader stakeholder sort of sector looked at the counterfactual of the way that we've gone about introducing the EVED scheme now, and we got further down the road of mass adoption, and then say with a year to go before the scheme needed to be implemented, sprung it on people. I think that there would be, rightly, quite an adverse reaction to that, because people would have made the decision to make the switch and then would have EVED as part of that process. It's better to give people the certainty of knowing what's coming.
I'm suggesting that you still give them 2 years' notice, but you do it later after the next wave of adoption, which, as the chair has said, is quite a different cohort of drivers. Like we don't want to risk putting them off any more than they already are with the incumbent inconvenience that we haven't yet solved.
Yeah, I do see where you're coming from, but at the same time, the ZEV mandate and the policy measures that we are implementing are designed to facilitate the broadest possible uptake of EVs over an ambitious timeline. We can't keep deferring decisions about how you continue to fund critical infrastructure on the road network. You need something to be able to fill in the gap of what will happen if we get this transition right and realise the benefits and opportunities from it. That's why it's important that we have this conversation now, in my view.
The road budget is more important than the transition numbers.
No, it's a balance between both things. You can't facilitate the transition and then not be able to continue to maintain the network on which these EVs run.
Okay. Right. Still on EVD, but it's interesting that the government, I don't know whether it's DFT or Treasury, chose the quite crude mileage mechanism when this was potentially an opportunity to start thinking about congestion, reducing congestion using more dynamic versions of charging for road use. It's been and obviously there's a lot of public pushback against that, spy in the cab and all of that. But it has been suggested that we could introduce that sort of concept via in the same way we did with water metering, which there used to be a lot of objection to. Is the DFT looking at the policy opportunities with different forms of charging excise duty or vehicle duty or whatever you want to call it?
Might it be worth pointing to the consultation?
Yes, I think so. Treasury are consulting on the sort of the methodology by which it's implemented. I think they're trying to balance the need for speedy implementation and acceptability and deliverability and to raise revenue with the time available effectively. And obviously, any conversation about a new tax in the motoring space often ends up with a discussion about time of use charging, congestion charging, that sort of stuff. But this is the approach that the Treasury decided to take, and that's what they consulted on.
Yeah, we're very interested in what the DFTs take in terms of wider transport policy, reducing congestion, which is such a barrier to economic growth, plus the pollution costs as well. But I think I'm straying away from the core objective of today's session, but I'm happy to have a chat with you sometime about that. Let's now move on to government messaging. Rebecca.
Government timelines relating to the EV transition have changed multiple times. Can you guarantee consistency in EV policy going forwards to provide confidence to both consumers and the market? And I realise we've asked some of those questions indirectly already, but are you completely convinced that is deliverable?
Well, I suppose what I would just repeat is that timelines haven't changed under this government, and I'm kind of cognizant of the point you made about the different track that was taken under the last government, because they could see the ambitiousness and the challenge that was inherent in facilitating this transition. This government isn't interested in walking away from the transition because it's difficult. We believe it's absolutely fundamental, and we've been unequivocal really that we believe the future is zero emission, and we're going to work at pace with partners in the charging and the automotive sectors to make that happen. The 2030 phase-out date, sort of as I said in my opening remarks, is the most important aspect of this in my view. It's what gives the sector the long-term certainty, but it's also a figure that can be sort of baked into people's minds about this is when we want to see this transition realised. I think it's just also important to think about how far we've come, both in terms of uptake, but also just how much is in train in terms of investment in the transition. So from the government side, that's £7.5 billion. The automotive sector has invested billions in adapting their supply chains. £6 billion has been put forward by the charge point sector. The direction of travel, in my view, couldn't really be clearer, but we have to continue to be consistent in our approach around messaging. And, the DFT has run our Get That Electric Feeling campaign. Don't know if anybody's seen it. I think what's really important about that campaign is it's not myth-busting about EVs, and I think too often we go down a narrow rabbit hole of kind of challenging people's views about issues to do with range anxiety, which of course is very necessary. Now we want to get into the space of actually talking frankly about the benefits that this could bring to people's lives, because if you can charge for as little as 2 pence a mile and get from London to Sheffield for £5, I can understand the benefit that would bring to my life, and hopefully consumers can too. The government's unashamed about the transition, is positive, ambitious and optimistic about it, and that's what I really want to kind of see coming through in terms of our messaging in that space. Consistency has to just be, it can't just be a sort of, let me counter your view about the transition. It has to be, this is what we have positively to offer. I don't know if there's anything else.
I might add a point on that, which is the reason for optimism on the transition generally is the positivity of EV drivers about the vehicles once they've had them. So 80-90% of people would recommend this to their friends and family, wouldn't go back to a combustion vehicle. And because of that, virally, you'd expect this to spread naturally. But there's been there's a lot of misinformation out there for a long time about this, and that is all people have read about some of this technology. So as people become exposed to it and are socialised with it through their friends and family, they will become more positive about it. So the reason the Electric Feeling campaign is focusing on the positive things, it's focusing on they're great to drive, charging is the issue you think it might be, and look how cheap they can be to run. And although that doesn't apply to everybody, we'll come on to the cost of public charging, it does apply to 67% of drivers do have access to off-street parking, and not many of them know that it seems that they can run their vehicles for 2 pence a mile if they get the right tariff, which is staggeringly cheap.
The problem is that's very annoying for the significant proportion of people in this country who don't have off-street parking.
And can I just following on of that, I completely agree with what the chair's just said. I think we all get that if you have one, it's great. I think the problem is that for the vast majority of people still, they can't have one, for whether that's an economic reason. I mean, it's great, we've heard that there's now some under 20,000, but £30,000 for the average family is a lot of money to be spending on a car. So I think, my question is, are you not concerned it's going to stall because the rollout? So you might get to 2030 where there's no more electric combustion engine cars being sold, but we've still got literally millions of combustion engine vehicles on the road. What are you going to do about scrapping, about maintaining those? And are we not just going to see a stalling where everyone that can do the early adoption does it, and then everyone else is stuck with these combustion engine cars potentially for 10 to 15 years? Because actually, what's the point in them changing it if that infrastructure doesn't roll out? If pavement parking doesn't provide this 2p a mile that gets you from London to Edinburgh for a £5. Like, I love the ambition, but the reality of this at 2030, I just don't see how that Get That Feeling campaign can combat the reality of the millions of combustion engine cars that people are just potentially going to hang on to, because we've got war in Iran, cost of living, terraced houses from the Victorian era that aren't going anywhere that we're going to have to tackle. So, to my constituents who live in either an urban area or small villages in the countryside, the Get That Feeling campaign is great if you can have it on your drive, but people who could have it on their drive have already done it. How do we get, you're not going to see a stalling in 2030 where people are stuck with expensive combustion engine cars and can't make the transition.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And, one campaign alone cannot facilitate the amount of work that needs to be done. And, we're out here making the positive case for EVs because it's clear that once people have experienced them, they don't want to go back. That doesn't change the material point you've made, that we need to ensure that this market becomes mature as quickly as possible to facilitate that transition. And I hope through the points that I've, second-hand EV sales being up over the same period in March when we saw the highest ever month of sales for EVs in the UK, that market is starting to grow. But you're right to say, unless we can make sure that it's democratised and people have got access to those cheap rates at home, we're not going to be able to see the scale of adoption that we want to. And that's where those home and workplace grants are incredibly important, where you can half the cost of installation. Since 2022, all new buildings, including flats, have to install an EV charge point, but also, most importantly...
Unless it's covered, unless the car parking is at the basement, where most of the parking is in the new flats in my area, and also planning rules is less require either no resident parking or less than one per flat. So there's a lot of there's still a lot of barriers to those people who don't have their own private on-street parking.
Before Elsie comes in with a final question on this, we've obviously also got this paper mile scheme coming in as well. How do you incentivise people when you're also changing the playing field for them? Because again, a lot of people have purchased electric vehicles in good faith. Maybe that was naive. Of course, that was going to change at some point. But again, going particularly to those lower income families, how does that transition remain attractive when actually, let's say things do settle in the Middle East, petrol prices come down? If you've got to make that call of, well, I'm paying per mile as well as having to pay for through the nose on street parking and things like not parking charging.
Yeah.
How is that going to help, do you think?
Well, I suppose the point is that, we've not sort of sprung this on people to the extent that the EVED proposal doesn't come into effect for 2 years. Also, if you already own an EV, you will still, through the EVED proposals, be paying less than you would have otherwise paid in fuel duty. You combine that with accessing the home charging and you unlock the benefit. But as you are right to say, it's that access to cheap charging on your street if you don't have a private driveway, which is the key enabler. And I can point back to the home and workplace grants, but I feel like I've done it ad nauseum and I won't waste the chair's time. But also a really important piece of that puzzle is the Levi funding, which not only allows local authorities to install public charge points in a way that makes the most sense to suit their communities, but also can get into that quite tricky conversation about what type of charging infrastructure is most appropriate in each place. So when I went to Ipswich, right back when I started in this role, they're doing pavement gullies because of the nature of the parking that they have outside residential properties in suburban areas. Well, I won't preempt it then, Chair, but I'm just saying you need a suite of measures.
So, thank you, Rebecca. Elsie?
Yeah, just one final question on government messaging. So one witness characterised this government's policy to us as having a foot on both the accelerator and the brake at the same time. We've obviously referenced the return of the electric car grant and EVED, for example. Do you understand why ordinary people feel like this, that the government has sent out mixed messages? But also, do you understand why some in the sector feel like that as well?
You've got to develop policy to reflect the changes that are taking place within the automotive sector. That's why kind of EVED needed to be introduced, in the sense that we've got to find a way to continue to maintain our road network and think about the contribution that fuel duty currently makes to the public finances. I would say in terms of the overall timelines and in terms of the government's commitment to the EV transition, I don't think the automotive sector is questioning that. I think we've actually been incredibly clear, to the extent where some people might wish that we'd been less clear. But I think what we're trying to do is, whether it's through the home and workplace grants, through the ECG, is create more reasons to say yes to people making that leap. And it's fair to say that people look at a scheme like EVED and they think, right, what impact will this have on the total cost of ownership of having this vehicle? It's our obligation to explain that in terms of its in terms of contrasting it with fuel duty, you're still able to access fantastic savings with home charging. We've got to make that argument and be clear about it. So I'm always very happy to accept challenge if people don't think that we've been clear enough, and that's certainly something I can take away and reflect on. But Richard, I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
No, I think just on the point about consumer messaging and the point I made earlier about people with driveways have already done it. They haven't. I mean, to be blunt, the number of EVs on the road is just getting close to 2 million. There's 34 million cars, something like that, on the UK's roads, and a large portion of people who've currently got vehicles have got off-street parking and haven't yet made the switch to EV. And if you can convince those people to make the switch to EV, that gives you the supply into the used market of all those EVs and helps manufacturers meet the mandate. That's why, I mean, if what was true they'd all done it, then we would be moving on to the next and trickier segment. There's no denying the fact that the equity issue between those with off-street parking and on-street is the single biggest challenge to the EV transition, I think, and we recognise that. But the job is not done with people with driveways. Let's just be clear about that, and that's why the messaging is really important, because we saw an instant impact in interest in EVs from the change in public messaging by previous governments, in terms of you can just see it live in the data on Auto Trader. So the consistency and positivity is really, really important, and things like the electric car grant, I think, really, really help with that.
Yeah, do you understand why people in the industry are saying that it feels like the government's got its foot on the pedal, the accelerator and the brake at the same time?
It's challenging to create systems which reflect what the reality of the transition will bring, whilst also having a suite of measures which incentivise EV uptake. That's certainly a challenge that I recognise.
Okay, well, we're going to come on to some of the policy solutions that we've been looking at. Scott.
Thank you, Chair. Richard, that equity issue between on-street and at-home charging, have you discussed with Treasury the differential VAT rates, about the need to equalise that?
Well, we are, at the budget last year, we announced we're doing a review into the cost of charging. Obviously, VAT is a matter for the Treasury, but there's a whole bunch of different...
Surely it's not good enough to say it's a matter for Treasury. It's something that does impact on your mission to drive up EV sales.
But it isn't the only reason...
It's substantial. We talked about the cost of on-street charging, particularly for people with lower incomes. It's a huge barrier, is it not?
It is, but VAT is not the only makeup in that cost stack. Basically, there are other things in the cost stack which we can look at, which are not matters for the Treasury, and which we're discussing with Desnes, and it's the reason we've launched an independent review into the cost of charging. Obviously, the manufacturers and the charging operators are making a big investment. They've all got lots of capital. They're the 6 billion figure the Minister mentioned, and they're rolling out the charge points. They need to make a return. The question is,
We'd love it if you cut the VAT as well, wouldn't they? They would love it.
I'm sure they would.
As would my constituents.
Yeah, but also, the headline figures on the cost of charging, I think, can sometimes be slightly... If you shop around, you can get... the critical threshold on public charging is about 50 pence kilowatt hour. If you can charge a car for less than that, then basically it's cheaper than petrol.
That's still 10 times more than the number you're quoting for driveway.
Exactly, but it's cheaper. It's cheaper than petrol. So, and some of those tariffs are available now. If you join various schemes or you shop at various supermarkets, you can get public charging that is less than the cost of petrol. It's worth clocking that.
Okay. So I'm keen to talk about second-hand values, which you've touched on a lot about. And you did mention, Keir, that 80% of sales are second-hand. So the electric car grant's interesting, isn't it? Did you think about, rather than spending that money on new purchases, spending it on second-hand purchases to try to stimulate the second-hand market and enable those people on lower incomes to enter the EV market? Did you think about it?
Well, in terms of the design of the scheme, I suppose I've already spoken about this kind of flow-through effect you have if you have an ECG where there are now 100,000 cars which, after they've been used by their initial owner, can then flow into the used market with the guarantees on battery health that are part of its warranty to allow that better democratic access. The challenge is, and Richard, I think you'd be better placed to expand on this than I, in terms of the complexity of designing a scheme which would be for used models is inherently more difficult. And we've spoken about the complexities of the public understanding what the benefits are in terms of even just the ECG for new vehicles. The government needs to make sure that the money that it puts in translates to real benefits for consumers, but that consumers can also understand what the government is doing to try and make that difference. I don't know if there's anything to expand on in terms of scheme design.
No, I think the way the electric car grant works is the department deals with 20 or so manufacturers and they invoice us or we pay them the grant. It would be a completely different... It's not a question of extending the electric car grant to used vehicles. It would be a completely different scheme and an order of magnitude. It'd be much more expensive, and you'd need to have a grant that had an impact on the value. It'd be very, very expensive as well. So it'd be hard to implement. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it would be a very, very different scheme. And
you'd be supporting people on lower incomes, and you'd be also supporting a lot of smaller businesses who are selling these cars.
I think the key point of the second-hand market is that some of the car manufacturers are unhappy because used EVs can depreciate faster than used petrol vehicles, which basically means they get to cost parity quite quickly. And at the point they're at cost parity, they're very attractive to people, which is why they are the fastest selling category vehicle on Auto Trader. So it's not that it's impossible to do. It's basically whether that's the right use of limited public funds, I think, is the question.
Yeah, but that rapid decline in residual values, great news if you're in the market for a second-hand EV. But it's horrendous news if you just bought one or if you're a leasing company, isn't it? So in the short term, the very short term, does the electric car grant have the impact of actually further depressing second-hand value of cars?
It depends on the model, to be perfectly honest. I mean, depreciation varies across all the different models, and it's quite dynamic. It's changing all the time. We look at the data every month, and the gap in depreciation between EVs and petrol vehicles is narrowing over time. And a lot of it's about demand. So as used EV demand goes up, the depreciation rate we suspect will go down as you'll get more demand. So,
and what about the electric VED?
Yeah.
It's going to further depress second-hand values, isn't it? Because it's going to create less demand.
There's no sign of that yet.
It will, though, won't it? It's another barrier to buying one, either new or used, isn't it?
I suppose you would argue that if you were likely to be paying more than in fuel duty, if you bought a used petrol vehicle, proportionately, you'd be getting a better deal with a used EV than you would with a petrol vehicle.
Should be grateful. Okay.
No, it's just a reflection of the market.
Yeah. The other interesting thing is it's a flat charge irrespective of vehicle type, whereas currently the duty I pay on fuel, if I've got a huge, I was going to name a brand there, a huge SUV, I'm paying way more. A really expensive, really inefficient car, I pay way more. But with the EVD, I pay the same, no matter how big and how inefficient my vehicle is. So is that not, again, a subsidy for people who are able to afford these bigger, more expensive, less efficient cars?
Well, I think one thing that we're starting to sort of pick out in the debate today, I suppose, is around having a simple scheme that people can understand and is technologically efficient and that works for their lives, and then having something that's complex and might compound some of those factors around unease people have about the introduction of the measure.
We're getting to the points on equity.
It's a real shame that simplicity seems to benefit the wealthier.
Well, EVs are heavier vehicles across the board, really, by nature of their design, I suppose, is a challenge.
which many say also contribute to the degradation of our road surfaces, whatever they are. But you...
So in terms of the second-hand market, I mean, if you're lucky enough to have an employer who has a salary sacrifice scheme, you can get a second-hand vehicle leased. There's a couple of operators that will do that. But if you're a private buyer, you can't get a second-hand vehicle on a leasing scheme. We heard earlier that in France they've got this social scheme to help people who are perhaps on lower incomes access a vehicle. Is that something that's been considered? I've not really looked at the French scheme, so I can't tell you.
I think you can buy second-hand vehicles. I think I'm right. You can buy second-hand vehicles with a leasing scheme, but there's no government support for that.
That's the social scheme,
the social leasing scheme is something that I think the French government has.
They have done, and it was very oversubscribed, and they had to sort of pause it for a while, I think. We're talking to the sector all the time about other things we can do. The single best thing we can do to support the used vehicle market is to boost demand for electric vehicles, to be perfectly blunt, because that increases residual values, makes the whole of the value better, which is good for the leasing companies. I think it's a fair point about allowing other people to access some of the benefits. Some of the tax benefits for EVs it's just being perfectly candid, are definitely skewed towards fleets and businesses because there are levers there that can be pulled and have been pulled, so benefit in kind tax, which is how you get benefit in salary sacrifice. Those just don't exist in the private vehicle space, which is why we have electric car grant to try and counterbalance some of that. But it's good to see providers offering second-hand EVs and salary sacrifice schemes, which is open to the NHS does a salary sacrifice scheme for EVs, so that is open to lots and lots of people. We shouldn't sort of play that down. But we are cognizant of the fact that there is a slight imbalance between the overall offer for private purchases is not the same as the overall offer for fleets and businesses.
It's tricky, though, isn't it? Because you said the only show in town is to increase demand for electric vehicles, and clearly the low residual value will help do that because it makes the cars more attractive in the second-hand market. But for a first-time buyer, that's not a great proposition, knowing that you're going to face this huge drop in value. Or if you're a leasing company, there's lots of uncertainty in the risks you face as a company. Or if you're the leasee, you're faced with higher monthly costs because you're taking on board that drop in residual value. So how do you ride those two horses of, really, you like the low second-hand values, but up front, someone's actually paying all that value and losing it, aren't they? So how do we get the balance right, I guess?
Well, it's tricky. I mean, the first point to make, I think, is that we're still in the early stages of EV rollout in the market. So the early hybrid cars had very high depreciation because the market wasn't sure about the value, and early EVs had very high depreciation because the market wasn't sure about the value. They wasn't sure about battery longevity. They weren't sure about demand. I think that is now changing. You're going to get it's maturing over time. There are better products in the market. Poor cars will depreciate faster than better cars. You're seeing some new EVs with waiting lists because there's such strong demand for them. Equally, I think one of the effects of the ZEV mandate is actually you're seeing manufacturers, because they effectively obligated to sell more EVs, they are offering very good lease prices for new EVs. So they are in a way insulating new purchasers of some of that depreciation hit, and they're not very happy about that, and they talk to us about that.
And even them, they're above the £100 a month leasing charge, which is key to getting middle income earners.
Yes, but there's quite a lot that are sort of now sub £200 and in the sub £300 rate. So it's developing, as I said at the start, it's very, very dynamic. And it changes all the way. It changes through the year as products come out. But we are cognizant of it, and we are watching it.
Oh, it's good to hear. And another issue on the second-hand market is servicing and maintenance, and the appropriate spread geographically of skills of mechanics in that field. I've heard in the last 48 hours about a car seller in Inverness who can't get a mechanic qualified on EVs within 30 miles. And we touched on geographic spread or lack of in terms of charging. What is the government doing to address the challenge of ensuring there's adequate people qualified and experienced to service and maintain and repair EVs?
Well, I might turn to you, Richard, in terms of sort of intergovernmental working, but one thing that I would say just on the regional disparity point is that I actually think the sector is preempting quite a few of these challenges. So I visited a Ford dealership recently where we had quite an extensive discussion about retraining and skills, and the fact that not only is this quite an attractive proposition for young people to want to feel like they're part of a sort of technology of the future, but actually in terms of reskilling existing auto mechanics, that's a process that automotive manufacturers are sort of taking on because they can see the direction of travel. More broadly, on that point around regional disparity, especially as it relates to vehicle maintenance, but also to things like charge point access, I think part of that is to do with the sort of natural evolution of the market, where you had areas of high density and high disposable income is where you first saw EVs sort of spread in places like London, and increasingly actually you're seeing the share of population in respective parts of the UK start to match the prevalence of things like chargers. So correct me if I'm wrong, Richard, but I think it's 15 to 16% of chargers are in rural areas in the UK now, and that broadly matches the amount of our population that is in those areas. So I think in terms of equity geographically is starting to see that spread occur across the piece. But I wonder, is there anything else to say on
No, I'd say on skills, it's a big issue. The Auto Council, which is like the government's interaction chaired by DPT ministers with the sector, is very cognizant of this, both in terms of the skills to manufacture the vehicles in the UK, but also to maintain them going forward. And there was a great article in the Auto Express just about this topic, I think only last week, how some garages have to retrain people, how they're moving to more mobile mechanics, how it's a wholly different world because it's about high voltage electrics as opposed to changing oil. So that it's happening. It's not happening uniformly, and it's recognised, I think, in the sector as something they have to basically do.
That's good to hear. Okay, now we move on to battery health.
I've got just a quick question on commercial vehicles, if that's okay. Commercial residual values.
I do apologise.
It's my fault.
Yes, you're right.
Yeah. So, sense of reluctance to get involved too much in the second-hand market and propping it up is for ordinary cars. Is commercial vehicles different? Thinking particularly about all the small businesses that rely on them, both new and then used. Is there space there to think about propping up the second-hand market?
Do we want to talk about vans now, or shall we save?
Well, commercial vehicles more generally.
Yeah. Particularly end of life and second-hand commercial vehicles, because that was the section we're on at the moment. So resale value and so on.
I think the challenges will be the same in a way in terms of coming up with the scheme. What's happened? I know that London ran a scrappage scheme to get moved dirty vans off the road to try and get people moving into zero emission ones. I think the challenges on the van market are quite unique, and we can talk about it in due course. I think it's easier for government to be blunt, to intervene in the new vehicle market in a way and create demand broadly, which you then hope would flow through into the second-hand market. If you have the right, and local authorities do a lot on this, you have the right parking policies, you have the right incentives in terms of tolls and other things, you can encourage people to move into those technologies. There is definitely an issue with away from the big fleets with demand for zero-emission vans at the moment, which we need to look into.
So you acknowledge that, and we'll come to that later, will we? Okay.
As a yes or no, do you see potential in a time-limited residual value guarantee scheme to address the certainty around end-of-life values for commercial vehicles?
I think while we recognise there are challenges in the take-up of commercial vehicles and that residual values play a part of that, I think the existing suite of measures that we have is what we're focused on delivering to drive uptake.
Okay, so you're not ruling it out, looking at it. Okay, thank you very much. Right, sorry, Alex.
Thank you, Chair. Battery health is something that worries would-be consumers, probably because we're used to batteries in our phones that go wrong after a short amount of time. In Labour's manifesto, it committed to having standardisation for battery certification, and the UN helpfully have Global Technical Regulation number 22. In the DFT's evidence to us, you said that you were analysing options for its implementation. What is it that you're analysing, and when do you think this might happen?
So I think the first point to make about battery degradation is that it was massively overstated as an issue with zero-emission vehicles. If you look at the data, and we've looked at a lot of the data, then it just isn't an issue. The car's going to wear out before the battery pack does, to be perfectly honest, and degradation is typically, between 1 and 2% a year, which means in a vehicle that's got a 300-mile range, you're not really going to notice it. I think it is a concern for consumers. And there are lots of products available by third parties now already in the marketplace that come in to fill that need, that are doing battery checks and offering data on EVs. The question is that standardised, and is that in a form which consumers can use? And I think we have consulted, or we're in the process of consulting on adopting the UN approach, which we'd aim to do, I think, for later this year. So we recognise it's a big issue, and we'd like to move forward on it, and are planning to do so.
Thank you, Chair. A big issue with electric vehicles is either misinformation or people having perhaps inaccurate and outdated perception. So the government has launched the Get That Electric Feeling campaign, which is an interesting name. And what evidence do you have as to the reach and effectiveness of that campaign?
Well, I suppose just to set out in the first instance, I think unfortunately I'm in the wrong age bracket for the Get That Electric Feeling campaign. So I've unfortunately not been able to realise its benefits personally in the way that I know other people have. But nevertheless, just going back to the point I raised before, the principle of that campaign is not to be sort of myth-busting and correcting when it comes to the principle of EV adoption. It's to practically demonstrate to people how it can make a difference in their lives in the context of the challenges that people are facing with cost of living pressures and the global moment that we find ourselves in. So unlocking the benefits of home charging, the resilience that provides for you and your family being able to get to where they need to go, but also kind of understanding that, the majority of people for a full charge in their EV, that constitutes about 2 weeks driving, doesn't it, really? But people have got that residual concern about, well, what if I want to go see my family in Scotland? What if I want to go to France? What if I want to make that one big trip? And the Get That Electric Feeling campaign is designed to give people a positive understanding of the reality of EV ownership. The campaign is just rolling out currently, so I'm not sure we're in a space to say definitively that it has had X or Y impact on market uptake, because we're just not in that stage yet. But we, of course, monitor both the value for money of the campaigns that we run through the Department for Transport and also measure its impact on consumers very closely. So I hope to be able to say more on it in due course, unless you have anything you want to add at this stage, Richard.
Well, I think we work very closely with a whole bunch of industry, charge points, auto sector stakeholders about developing the campaign. And one of the interesting things from that discussion was actually, I've been doing this so long, I've written endless leaflets busting myths on EVs, which get stuck on some shelf somewhere. And what I think some of the learning from the pandemic was actually you don't want to focus on the myths, because by repeating the myth, you reinforce the myth, and actually you want to focus on...
£150 million a week, for example.
So you want to focus on the positivity. And lots of the consumer research about EVs says, why does no one talk about how great they are to drive? They're great cars to drive. So we're aiming to basically focus on the positivity, and it's very targeted on the people who are most likely to buy an EV new and who have access to off-street parking. So it's both positive and quite tightly targeted.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that about the driving thing, because that's evidence that we've seen, is that when people actually try it, they're surprised by the acceleration, how good they feel to drive. Do you think that there's more that the department could do to promote practical opportunities for people to actually try it and see it for themselves? Because sometimes seeing is believing.
There's a whole ecosystem of organisations out there who do exactly that, and there are some very active EV positivity bodies. There's podcasts. There's the manufacturers themselves having weekend-long test drives. Would a DFT-sponsored roadshow test drives get any more traction than one run by those organisations? I'm not sure it would, but it's entirely right that it's all about getting people in the cars. Once they're in the cars, and often they are converted. We've looked at it in the past. We've sponsored stuff like this in the past. We're not in that space at the moment, I don't think, because there's so much else happening, and because the manufacturers, because of the mandate, are so motivated to sell the cars themselves.
I would just add to that I think there are a series of events, like demonstrator events, that are being planned in high footfall areas in partnership with the retailers themselves. But you'll be unsurprised to hear that with the ZEV mandate existing, and with it being ambitious, automotive manufacturers and dealerships are doing everything they can to push forward really progressively in this space. I mean, when I visited that Ford dealership, if they have to give somebody a courtesy car, they'll give them the electric Ford Puma, and people come back and go, actually, this was great. This was a great experience. How can I make the change? Similarly to that, there's the point around making sure that the ECG, which can deliver enormous benefits for people, unlocking almost $4,000 off the cost of an EV, making sure that people know that money is coming off because of the government grant. So Auto Trader will actually display the relative costs with the ECG applied on their website, and I think that makes an enormous difference as well, where people can see that the government's behind the transition, to make them feel like holistically both the sector and the UK more broadly is moving at a formidable pace in this direction.
Elsie, did you want to come in at this point?
No.
No, sorry, that's okay. Right, we'll now move on to Alex and charging infrastructure, which we've touched on.
Kind of done some of that
We've
already.
done some of this already.
Yeah.
Do you want to pick up anything that we've not?
So perhaps you could just talk us through the relationship between the department and local transport authorities in terms of trying to make sure we have an equitable spread of charging infrastructure.
Absolutely. So I'll start and then feel free to build on this, Richard. But the Levi scheme is designed to facilitate this really close working between local authorities, the Department of Transport, OZEV. It does that in a number of key ways. First of all, it gives local authorities the agency to pursue technological solutions which work best for their areas, which is really important given factors to do with urban density, existing transport infrastructure, things like that. But also it focuses on capacity building among staff within local authorities, and that's an incredibly important piece of the puzzle. We don't want this to be a sort of process whereby the Department for Transport, has these ambitious targets, but how does it translate to Rebecca, if you don't mind me using your example from earlier, it's very similar to Selby actually, where you have a series of market towns with rural villages interdispersed between them. What you have to do in that context is very different to what you need to do in Manchester city centre. So actually making sure that people have got the skills within local authorities to apply them to those local contexts is incredibly significant. There's £400 million overall is going into the scheme. We think that will mean that 100,000 more chargers are able to be rolled out than would have otherwise been the case. But we need to do it in a way that is actually based on the kind of lived reality of people in their areas. So with whichever local authority members represent in England, you will have a Levi scheme, and it will be trying to make those decisions about what best suits your local communities. But you're at the coalface of this, Richard, so I wonder if you want to add anything else.
Just before you carry on, you're talking about local authorities kind of as if it's just one in the singular. When there is a combined authority and they are the transport authority, they're getting the money, and yet an awful lot of this is about highways. Is there any inherent problem or challenge, particularly as this is going to become a bigger issue as we roll out more of those kind of authorities, that actually that on the ground piece is being delivered by not the organisation that gets the cash?
Well, the way Levi was structured is the country is divided up into 81 zones. Those authorities decide to work together to deliver the charging infrastructure. So the whole of England is covered, and all of those areas, there's one local authority that's opted out because they've already got so many charge points. It's the one we're in at the moment. But all the other 81 schemes have got the money. There's 400 or so staff that have been funded by central government to roll out the charge points. There's a huge amount of procurement going on as we speak. It's going to take time to put those in place. But the thinking behind Levi is it's going to deliver a step change in the visible offer for people without off-street parking. Rather than seeing, one charge point out of cul-de-sac that's out of service, you're going to see thousands across your local authority area, and that will make you confident that you can own and buy and use an EV going forward. And it's going to take some time to get all those on the road. But of the interventions government can make, there's one on consumer experience generally, there's one on the offer for people doing long journeys, but this is the one that's going to help tackle the issue around the availability of public charging for people without off-street parking.
Is this definitely the right way of doing it? Do we need all these individual areas procuring their own very slightly different sets of charging infrastructure when across the rest of continental Europe they're very much having exactly the same between countries? Why do we need it to be different when I cross the border between Bedfordshire and Cambridgeshire?
I wouldn't say the difference would be so material that users are going to find challenges in application across boundary lines. What I would say is you need to design schemes which reflect what the actual makeup of the places where you're seeking to install this infrastructure are. So, for example, to use the same example, when I was in Ipswich and they focused on channel like pavement gullies, that works really well if you're in suburban areas where people have often got dedicated charging spaces outside of their home and are able to kind of charge their cars that way. That's not as applicable to sort of a dense urban centre where lamppost charging or whatever else might be more applicable. So I think we want to make this as convenient for people as possible, and therefore having nuance in how these schemes are applied is very important. But in terms of standard types of being able to charge and, you know, ease of access through that regard, I don't think there'll be such a material difference that consumers will have a challenge with it.
Yeah, and I think it's important to distinguish between sort of low power overnight charging, which is what Levi is focused on, so trying to get as close as possible to the home charging experience of other people, with the offer for higher power charging on longer journeys. You know, what we'd expect is consumers basically to join a scheme to get access to a lower tariff, to make it quite low stress, and to just plug in at night and then go home. So it shouldn't be a question of basically you having a very different approach. But long concession contracts to try and drive the price down and get lots of rollout in the local authority areas is the thinking behind it.
Moving to street work permits, which you know this committee is interested in. Despite recent changes that allow the use of street work permits, local authorities are often still using Section 50 licences for charging infrastructure installation. How do you feel that the department can help local authorities feel comfortable in using a permitting regime to speed everything up?
Well, I've seen many things in my time as a Member of Parliament, but I've never seen somebody whoop street works. That's got to be a first. Well, in April of this year, we amended the traffic management permit scheme regulations to improve how street works work for public EV charging point installation and how that's managed. So EV charge point operators, they now have been granted the sort of legal right to access the streetworks permit regime instead of those Section 50 licenses.
They're not taking it up,
not using it.
Well,
yes.
That's what the piece of the puzzle that we need to kind of solve is, and it also brings kind of consistently lower fees. And if you have a nationally standardised process, that better facilitates uptake, in my view. I don't know if there's anything.
No, I mean, to be honest, it hasn't been in for that long. We're interested to know where that's happening. We're happy to work with charge point companies and local authorities to make sure that it's being adopted. The whole point is to try and remove a barrier to implementation. That's what we're all about.
And then finally, you'll probably tell me this is a Home Office problem, but there is an increasing problem with cable theft, which means that charging points can be out of order. I had an example in my constituency where about 20 of them were chopped off outside a Starbucks. Is the department suggesting ways to try and make sure that charging points are as safe as possible? Anti-theft measures, any kind of best practice that you're spreading? Because I can see this might become an increasing issue, because obviously they're quite easy to sell on with the copper in them.
I mean, it's a real issue. It's a particular issue for high power chargers if they've got fat cables. It's not really an issue for on-street chargers, which is the majority of them, because they often have got sockets and the consumer has their own cable. We are aware of it. We do talk to the CPOs that are issued by this. There's no easy answer in a way. There's CCTV. Some of them are putting barriers that come down. I think some of them have got some paint sprays on people if it happens. Some of them are trying new techniques of putting steel around the cables. We haven't got an easy answer to it, but we are aware of it and we are talking to the CPOs about it.
Thank you.
Right, okay. I think John now.
Yeah, if it hasn't been covered, we've already discussed the sort of roughly the third of the population that don't have off-street parking. How does the government plan to ensure that EV charging infrastructure can be retrofitted into existing housing stock, especially for residents, for flats without off-street parking?
On this side,
yeah. Okay. So I mean, so if you're a typical house, then it's becoming a fairly mundane task for an electrician to fit a charge point on a house. It's just a question of connecting up to the consumer unit. If you're a homeowner, if you're a renter, then obviously you need the landlord's permission, and we have a grant to basically incentivise landlords and renters to put charge points in place. So it's not a barrier for them. So there isn't a sort of divide between homeowners and renters. And we've made a commitment to consult on whether we can do more to basically remove those barriers. What we don't want is a landlord basically holding a tenant to ransom and having extortionate fees to do it, or thinking about how they might charge for electricity that's going through a charge point. All of these are issues we're aware of that might need addressing as we move through the transition.
in Europe, there's like right to charge schemes, aren't there, in Germany, France? Is there any consideration of something like that for the UK?
That's a similar sort of concept to what we've been consulted on, which is basically ensuring that a tenant can't be refused without good reason the ability to charge an EV at home and exploring the options
many
around
housing
that.
associations have leaseholders. I mean, we're talking generally about leaseholders, and is the department looking at giving leaseholders the right to charge similar to that it operates in France, and I think in Germany.
We are publishing a consultation soon on this point to allow us to get a better understanding of how best able we are to support that, especially for leaseholders, but for private renters more broadly.
And supporting councils as well, and housing associations where most of the residents are actually tenants.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the benefits of actually having the infrastructure that the Levi scheme allows you to benefit from. We can then, it's not only just about funding, it's about disseminating those learnings more broadly, both from the local authority level back into central government and vice versa. And
just this point about covered versus open air charging parking areas for has that been resolved now? Are underground car parks now permitted to install EV charging?
At the moment, there's a requirement to fit charge points in new builds. There's exemption for underground car parks. We are looking again at that exemption. Yes.
Okay, because particularly now we know the evidence is that the EVs are less likely to be catch fire than ICE vehicles. Okay, thank you. Steph.
Thank you. One level down or up from the leaseholder is the housing association in my constituency in North Norfolk. They took vast swathes of estate from councils. They're pretty much designed and laid out the same way they were when they were council house estates. And it's even more complex than the typical town street, where at least the local council is in charge of the pavements and the roads. In these places, the parking is quite often part of the estate, but it literally part of the estate and run by a housing association. So they don't have numbered parking bays. To actually produce and provide EV charge points would require more than just the charge points. They'd probably require tarmacking and surface creation before you even get to the fact that the typical frustrated housing association resident in my constituency is a Motability Scheme user who's now eligible for an EV, who really needs to have it pluggable, innable by their house. This is a world away from having a viable solution. I'm not expecting that you're sitting on the answer and haven't told anyone. What is the answer as you see it in terms of how we discover what's going to work in those situations and how we can support housing associations to unlock that pretty big potential for EV adoption now we have price parity?
Yeah, I mean, so part of it is having a degree of technological agnosticism as to what methods work best in which places. And, Richard spoke about the ability to be able to access those kind of overnight low power charging rates and the cost benefits that brings through lampposts and whatever else like that is an important piece of the puzzle. It's also about making sure that people meet their obligations in terms of charge point installation from 2022 onwards in terms of those regulations. It's also about facilitating close working between OZEV, the DFT, Levi schemes and housing associations themselves. There's also probably a linkage piece there with MHCLG as well, which I think I'll take away from this session and pick up with the relevant minister, thinking about how we can join some of those dots and share best practice, actually. I think
just
that's
to be an
important
extra
point.
thorn in that side,
Please,
because I appreciate your commitment to do that. We don't have lampposts in most of these places, so access to cheap charging is, as you know, and the undertaking that goes from having a parking free-for-all, which is far from ideal already, to necessarily one with allocated parking, will require more than just painting some numbers on some tarmac.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's an important point as well, which hasn't yet come up around accessibility as well, and ensuring that charge point rollout, but also the use of cables is done in a way where everybody living in a local community is able to realise the benefits from it, but also not have their lives disrupted by it.
What is the department doing to address that issue? Where I think the disability campaign has said there was not a single public charge point in the UK that was accessible. Now, that may be old data, but what's the department doing to address that really important equalities issue? And while I'm on it, not just physical accessibility, but safety in terms of lighting and the location of points. Does the department have advice and/or regs on this stuff?
I think on the accessibility point, I think some of the CPOs think they are compliant with the PAS standard. They've certainly told us that they are. So it's interesting that...
it would be worth asking the...
No, absolutely. I think first, it's probably worth getting a look.
The accessibility statistic was to do with the strategic road network,
okay.
But I think the overall point still holds because you have responsibility over directly through the SRN, through your agency, but also more generally in terms of public policy.
I think the UK was one of the first countries to come up with a standard for accessible charge points. So we worked very closely with disability groups about that. I think we've done a review on it, which is suggesting that possibly it's so onerous that not many CPOs are adopting it. There's a question about whether we migrate to the alternative emerging European standard, which might be more deliverable and deliver, it's a bit of an 80-20, delivering most of the benefits, so that because lots of the charge point companies do think really hard about this sort of stuff, and some of it's really, really hard. If you have a curb, then what does that mean for people in wheelchairs, et cetera. And there's a balance being struck between, if you required it in every single charge point, you'd get far less charge points out there. So I don't think we've got the right answer at the moment. We've made a first step. We're in constant contact with the charge point companies and liaising with disability groups about what the right outcome is, and there's obviously more to do.
And you've also got an oversight role in terms of the Motability scheme, and many Motability users would, I'm sure, like to convert to get their next vehicle to be EV, but not if they're not going to be able to charge it easily.
Yep.
Okay. Right. Where am I now? Steph, have you're fixed with your question? So Rebecca.
Great, thanks. And just following on from the chair's line of questioning, I suppose the thought that's just come to mind is, and this links to cross pavement parking, but also the housing association, and also on street parking, is the plethora of disabled bays. And, obviously people don't have a right to a specific disabled bay, but just as a sort of supplementary before I launch into my main one, what work have you done on enabling people with disabled bays to be able to park at a disabled bay? Because obviously the chances are they don't use their vehicle as often. Are they expected to move further away to leave their car to charge it and then move it back, all of which sort of speaks to the point that the chair's just made about actually we're not there yet, are we, on how we provide for disabled communities. So I don't know if that's something you've thought about, or a particular niche issue that perhaps needs some thinking about.
It definitely needs careful consideration, and I'm certain that that work is going on with the department, but I don't have it to hand, so if you don't mind, I'll write to you and set it out, and I'll write to you as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just moving on to my actual question, sorry. The cross-pavement parking thing, we've talked about that a lot today, we've talked about it a lot before. I'm a former planning committee chair in a local authority where my local authority were resolutely not interested in pursuing it, yet they claim to be an incredibly green council. I'm glad that things have moved on. To me, it was it was a completely straightforward option. It's not going to solve all the problems, but having seen cables trailing out of people's top windows to their car down below where they lived in a flat in a terraced house, I've seen both sides. So I'm on board with cross pavement charging where it can be done properly. What are you doing to ensure that the department's guidance is being implemented swiftly so that we can actually see some progress?
That's incredibly important. So we produced that guidance in December of 2024, which is kind of designed to enable local authorities to develop their own policies and approvals for this technology. But at the same time, it's got to be cognizant of the fact that it's got to address the concerns that you have. And I actually think lots of people living in local communities have, where they don't want to see a free-for-all, in terms of installation. So I think it's at least 40 local authorities across the UK have got live schemes or trials to support the installation of cross-pavement channels, which obviously are opportunities for learning as well as they are opportunities for applications. We're trying to support local authorities financially with the rollout of this tech. So we've committed 25 million to local authorities in England to facilitate the rollout of the grants. And I think it's 80% of local authorities have applied for that funding. So we expect a lot more places to be able to offer these things in the future. We of course want to ensure that it's compliant with the guidance that we've produced, but kind of going back to the conversation that we previously had, it's got to be also done in a way that suits the format of local communities, as it were. So we're trying our very best to strike that balance. Don't know if there's anything you wanted to add,
No,
Richard.
I think like everything in this discussion, lots of these local authorities are on a journey, and some of them thought, I don't want these things across my pavement, so that'll be a nightmare, trip hazard, blah, blah, blah. And actually, a lot of their citizens are asking for them now, so there is demand for this, and actually it's quite an obvious thing to be doing where it can work. And I think it's particularly useful in areas where you haven't got huge pressure on residents on street parking. So in London, you may rarely get to park outside your house, but lots of other areas actually without street parking, you can quite routinely, and this is not an obvious way of opening up access to those low-cost tariffs for homeowners. So we're seeing more and more adoption, more and more interest. It's going to become more and more mainstream, I suspect.
there are local authorities like my own Hounslow, which politically is strongly in favour of all sorts of net zero policies and wanting to implement them, but does raise risks and concerns about the operation of cross-gully operation, and have actually said to me, I've just found the email from the cabinet member. Unfortunately, government guidance on this topic has not yet been able to identify solutions to their challenges, but they are keeping it under review, informed by continued monitoring of the trials taking place. So there are, as I say, a lot of authorities with positive policies on this, but have practical concerns about how it would work. So,
Yeah, and I just wanted to build on that a little bit. So I think one of the challenges you have, and I hate to burst your bubble, Richard, but ultimately it's not just in London that you can't park outside your house. I grew up on a road where you could only park on one side of the street. So if you live on the other side, and I've raised that as a point, my parents have just gone and bought a full hybrid because they're never going to get to plug it in outside their home because they happen to live on the wrong side of the road. Unless they're going to start digging up the whole road, they're not going to get to do that. So I think there's two questions there. What consideration have you given to expanding that, particularly smaller communities, villages? I mean, I don't have market towns, I have suburbs and then separate, one town. But also, a lot of even urban areas, I've got a community in my constituency that's effectively a number of villages that have merged into a suburb of the city. Using that, using the Levi scheme, the council just wrote round to local communities saying, we're going to stick the EV charging points on the quay, which is miles away from where most people actually live. So what consideration are you giving? Because I do genuinely like the concept, but I assume you're not using it as a one-size-fits-all and, oh, fine, we've delivered this, that's going to solve the problem. But then the follow-on question to that is, what has your guidance or what consideration have you given to dealing with the disputes that will no doubt come up amongst neighbours and the enforcement of people doing it without going through usual channels, so to speak? Because we already know that even drop curbs aren't done legally in many places. So we're also piling on a new level of responsibility to local authorities. It's great that they're getting guidance, but how do they fund the disputes, the policing of it with a small p, so to speak, and the processing of the applications, because they could go from 0 to thousands potentially, and I just think what seems like such a simple solution has lots of issues. So it might be too much for today, but how much consideration are you giving, and can you address some of those issues perhaps?
That's such an important point, and I suppose the answer to the first part of your question is that we need to do a number of things at once to facilitate this transition. You need to have a multiplicity of technological solutions. You need to offer clear guidance and applicable guidance, and I'll certainly take away the points that were raised by the Chair on this front around the types of technology which we believe are going to unlock the quickest and most efficient access to those home charging rates for the greatest majority of people in local authorities. Also cognizant of the fact, and I share the same challenges you do, that in rural villages those charging solutions become more complicated. That goes back to your initial point about fast charging on the strategic road network, because it's fair to say that whereas it might take you 90 seconds, minute and a half to fill up your tank with petrol, we're not in that space in terms of fast charging with EVs, but the technology is getting better and better, and the range of these vehicles is getting better and better. So whereas there was I'm
just very conscious of the
I'm sorry. So we've got to do a lot of things at once.
If questions could be big, but also your answers, what you're actually doing or going to be doing. We all know the options available. Okay, Rebecca, your last question.
My kind of second question, and again, there's a link between the two. So, that strategic road network, the rollout of high-speed charging at petrol stations isn't speedy enough. So I live just up the road from a petrol station. There's no EV charge there, and nothing in the neighbour. So I don't know what is being done with Levi to incentivise fuel stations to do that rollout. There's that question, but that links to issues with distribution of electricity and the access powers and rights that other utility providers have. So, obviously there's two ways of doing this. There's the super fast stuff that's provided perhaps in a in a dual use facility, but then you've also got the need for those on street charging points as well. And given that renewable energy companies can't even get attached to the grid when they're putting in air source heat pumps and solar panels on people's properties, it's a mixed market, it's a busy market. What are you giving consideration?
The specific issue that I hadn't twigged until recently is that other utility providers have access powers and rights over land, but DNOs don't. And what's being, presumably you've had conversations with DESNZ on this. Is that moving?
It's something we work really closely with both DESNZ and NISO on about reforms to the connections process, and we're very much advocating for EV charging stations to take better precedence within that hierarchy as we seek to reform the grid connection process. NISO's putting £58 billion into making sure that it is prioritised not just on this kind of first come first served basis, but that you clear the queue for kind of congested ready to deliver projects, of which a proportion are these EV fast charging sites. I don't know if there's anything to...
So in your question, lots of points there. So one, EV charging doesn't have to be at petrol stations. I think there's something about...
I realise it doesn't have to be, but clearly that's a useful place.
Particularly as we roll out HGVs who need ultra-rapid charging.
For long journeys, absolutely. We can come on to HGV charging in due course. I think there's... Levi is very focused on low power on-street charging because that's how you get the cheapest tariff available for citizens.
You need a space that you can sit in for a long time to do that.
Yes, but if cars spend 95% of the time doing absolutely nothing, they're parked somewhere at the moment. The question is the charging where they are parking? And there was an earlier point about some local authorities putting the chargers miles away from where everybody was. Some of these local authorities are on a journey. Some of them are viewing the EV transition through a sort of 2010 prism, and actually it's moved on a lot since then, and the idea is to stick some charge points in a convenient car park, and we look at all the plans and try and whilst reflecting local differences and local needs, make sure they are providing the good offer to people so they feel they could go and buy an EV. There's definitely a point about connections and working with DNOs to do that, but actually the rollout of rapid chargers is going probably faster than it is for the lower powered ones potentially. Though the numbers are bigger, they're expanding quite quickly because you're seeing a lot of commercial investment in rapid charging. I've seen lots and lots. There's over 1,000 rapid charging hubs in the country now, where you've got more than 8 chargers side by side. You're seeing them.
I mean, our HGV colleagues have said that the government could do more. They can't do it on their own, and National Highways ditto. So can I move on now?
The only other point I just want to raise is you said there are thousands in each local authority area of these charging points. Will be. Is that not also just an incredibly large amount of street furniture that adds other things, and that actually we're all going to end up living in a country where we're going to have potentially more charging points than lampposts and things, and
unless the lampposts are charging points.
Well, yes, but again, if you're giving all this Levi money now, the decision in my local authority seems to be that they're sticking charging units in, which there's never going to be enough to service everybody. Street lights, that's a strategic thing. If they don't make that call at the beginning, there's not an option, I'm assuming, to switch for a while.
The biggest provider of on-street charging is Ubitricity, is mainly lamppost charging. It depends on the local authority whether they've got. It depends where the lampposts are on the pavement. If the lampposts are offset pavement, then you can't have a trailing cable across them, so they're not all suitable. And if you're worried about street furniture, then there are options for flush-fitting charge points and poles that come out of the ground in heritage areas. There's lots of options out there.
Good. Okay, thank you. Now, we've touched on the disparity of charging costs and the inequity linked to that, but Scott.
Yeah, I mean, just to return to the inequity between at-home and on-street charging, you talked about reviews, etc., and you didn't want to talk too much about that, but realistically, things aren't going to change too much in terms of the cost of on-street charging because of the cost of investing in that. Is that fair? Or are you going to give us some hope?
I hope I've already given you hope in terms of the access point. If you have 100,000 more public chargers and you are better able to access it across the country, that of course creates an ease question. But we are looking at a suite of options as part of this review, which is going to be published in the autumn, to think about where we can go further, kind of working in partnership with the private sector on these questions. And I appreciate I can't go as far as you want me to on the VAT point, but we are looking at a comprehensive range of options about what we can do in this space. I don't know if there's anything else we can say for the moment.
Well, ultimately, it'll be a market, and you'll see increasing competition there. If you look at the spread of prices, it's quite broad, from sort of 20 pence a kilowatt hour all the way up to 90 pence a kilowatt hour, and you'll see more and more of that happening. And you're seeing commercial companies, so shops and destinations, offering subsidised charging to try and get people to have their car there, so then you go and shop in their location. So, yeah, there is hope, and I think over time, once the initial investment's been paid off for some of the chargeable companies, and you get more competition in the marketplace, then the prices will come down.
And I think,
So you don't see a government role in that aspect of the charging regime
in terms of
the cost of electricity at these points.
That's what comes out of the cost of charging review. I think that's basically our position on that, is to look at the entire cost stack, what's happening, whether there are options for government to maybe influence that.
So three very quick questions then. So firstly, on at-home charging, you have cars which are capable, vehicle to grid, but the cost of uploading and downloading electricity, the tariffs the government has on buying electricity makes that prohibitive. Is that something you're looking at?
Yes, there's a huge amount of interest in vehicle to grid, and ultimately, there's a spectrum of different ways you can access smart charging and lower cost tariffs. There's just charging your car on the off-peak and getting a low cost tariff for that. There's seeding control of your EV so that when it charges is controlled by.
Each time you download electricity, you're buying it, then you upload it again, then you buy it again. There's charges associated with that.
There isn't yet a mature market in vehicle to grid, but the technology is proving out, and it will mean lower cost tariffs for consumers that opt to do that.
Yeah, there's real opportunity there actually. So secondly, I think some of the evidence we have said the standing charges associated with on-street are making things difficult, and that's going to be a barrier to reducing costs. And I think this is a particular issue in rural areas because often the chargers aren't used quite as much. Is that a real issue and a real challenge you're aware of?
I mean, standing charges will be exactly one of the sort of stuff looked at in the cost of charging review. I think ultimately the rural...
hopes in that review then. Okay.
Lots of hopes in that review. The rural urban piece is quite interesting in charging. I heard the previous witnesses talking about broadband. It's very different for EVs. Ultimately, in the long term, the place will have the highest utilisation for a charge point is areas without good public transport, high car dependency, where people drive a long way, and that is rural areas. So it may be you're going to see better provision than we're expecting in rural areas because you're going to get more bang for your buck as a CPO in those locations.
Okay, so rural areas can be difficult for connections. The other areas that are difficult are motorway service stations. Is there support available there coming as well for those operators? Because otherwise those costs are going to be prohibitive.
Answer that as well. Yeah, we have been working with motorway service area operators for many years on this particular topic. They are making significant progress. I think 80% of the MSAs now have got over 6 charges. They've all got at least 6. I've got at least 6 as a minimum.
It's not very much though, isn't it, when you look at...
It depends, yeah, but it's a minimum standard, and those numbers are going up quite significantly over time, but there's a genuine issue, especially for your more remote motorway service areas, in getting power there. We tried a pilot with the Rapid Charging Fund to try and grant money to all the MSAs to get them to agree to upgrade the power. That didn't work for various reasons, so we're now coming up with an alternative approach.
Did that completely not work? I heard there was no connections arose from that pilot.
No, basically we had long discussions with all the MSAs, we had a short list of offers, and we couldn't agree on the terms of that grant because some of the
it wasn't
things,
in fact a pilot then, it was the whole.
well, it was, because we ran through the entire process and they agreed to withdraw they decided they weren't prepared to proceed. So we're looking at different ways of doing it because the problem hasn't gone away. We still need to get more power in those locations. We're definitely very much on it.
And a smaller issue which we are putting a lot of focus on in regard to the SRN is signage as well, which is obviously incredibly important in making sure people are able to access the benefits. But I think actually the motorway service sector is thinking quite holistically about this because they understand that that's where demand's shifting and they want to have their share of
I think signage is also useful for people like me who don't own an EV. It lets them tell them that actually charging points are all around me when perhaps you don't see them.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to let you swerve this, Minister.
Oh, no.
Differential, in fiscal policy, differential VAT rates are a really powerful policy driver. We have differential VAT rates in this space. So what conversations is the government, are you and your department having with the Treasury on addressing this disparity, particularly in addition to the various charges, 20% VAT on public charging points?
Well, we know that the debate is very live when it comes to VAT on public charging. I've also seen the recent legal ruling and the appeal that's happening as part of it. I, of course, have conversations with my Treasury counterpart, Dan Tomlinson, on these questions and will continue to do so through the development of the scheme. But that work is very much ongoing.
Well, we do hope that those are positive for the sake of those who don't have access to off-street parking at home. Right, thank you. Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, a very good segue, actually, thinking of interdepartmental cooperation. So, Mr. Bruce, your Office for Zero Emission Vehicles works across 2 government departments. How effective do you think it has been in coordinating the work across those 2 departments?
I think it's working pretty well, to be perfectly honest. So we have members of DESNZ that sit with us in DFT. We are very plugged in, no pun intended, to the work on electricity networks. I think the way I position it is the move to clean power and to electrify the entire economy. Transport's basically in the vanguard of that, so we are encountering problems in advance of other sectors. We have to electrify heat as well. Obviously, we're cleaning up the generation of electricity. And so we've done lots of work with DESNZ and Ofgem on things like the end-to-end review of how you get connections, on prioritising various connections. There's a thing called the Connections Accelerator Service. I've had lots of meetings with Secretary of State DESNZ and with Minister Shanks in DESNZ, and the Minister's very close with Minister White in DESNZ. So I think we're working pretty well, and it's not all easy. I mean, my observation would be the electricity regulatory structure was set up to basically manage down the cost of a stably sized electricity sector, and now we're in a world where we're trying to expand electricity sector to basically electrifying the economy, and those regulatory approaches aren't always appropriate, and we are changing them as we encounter them one by one. So we work with Ofgem on the Green Recovery Scheme. We're working about prioritising getting more power to the motorway service areas. So we're working very closely, and but there's more to do, I suppose.
Might I just add as well that actually having OZEV there is really a quite critical linchpin in terms of facilitating not only kind of interministerial discussions about these shared priorities and challenges, but also making sure that private sector stakeholders can get in the room with the right people interdepartmentally at the right time. So I'll be hosting a roundtable with DESNZ colleagues quite soon about decarbonisation and electrification of transport more broadly. OZEV is the kind of bridging mechanism that allows those conversations to take place. So from a ministerial standpoint, it's incredibly important.
Okay, thank you. And finally, HGVs and other commercial vehicles. Over to Elsie for the last couple of questions.
Thanks, Chair. Minister, early in this session you mentioned the importance of certainty. The haulage sector has requested a clear strategy from government for HGV decarbonisation. I've been speaking to HGV operators in my constituency where 17% of jobs are in that sector. They concur that much more support and further clarity is needed. What is the government's plan and how is this being communicated with the sector?
Well, thank you for that question, and I also have freight within my portfolio as well, and I think given what's happening in the Middle East and the impact that that's having on the haulage sector, I think this conversation is kind of more pertinent than ever, because if we can't facilitate HGV operators making that switch, then they can't benefit from the resilience that a decarbonised grid can can bring. We've got a sort of a three-pronged approach when it comes to facilitating the transition in this space. We've got sort of supply-side support. We've got and regulation. We've got demand stimulation, and also the point around charging infrastructure, which is incredibly important. So in January, we published a consultation on emissions regulations for HGVs, which closed in March, and we're expecting a second consultation later this year. We want to use this process to start creating supply-side certainty for the UK market about where the direction of travel is. Alongside this, we're making changes to our grants for HGVs, which we've made them significantly more generous. So they're increasing from 25 grand to £120,000 in some cases. We then are planning to kind of build on these changes with our announcement of £1 billion of support for zero emission commercial vehicles, and that includes the zero emission truck grant. So those are the measures that are kind of designed to drive demand. And then just finally, as part of that £1 billion announcement, we've also committed £171 million to the depot charging scheme, which directly supports infrastructure rollout. And we're of course publishing our zero emission HGV and coach infrastructure strategy shortly, which is going to allow us to look at these issues more holistically, but also kind of over the longer term as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Minister. The current industry data shows that there's been quite a limited take-up of electric HGVs. Does the government need to mandate a transition? We heard from the previous panel that Dr. Devane thought that was a good idea based on the success of the ZEV mandate. What do you think?
Well, we're exploring a lot of these questions through the HGV emissions regulation consultation, and I don't want to sort of preempt the response to it. But what I would say is that I think, like a number of other sectors, that there are a number of factors that are influencing demand in this market, and it feels like the lever that government has is over kind of total cost of ownership, kind of more so than anything else, to make financial sense for businesses, which I'm sure from your own constituency experience you'll know operate with these very fine margins, could unlock a number of efficiencies and cost-saving benefits from making the switch, but aren't currently able to do so because of the cost intensity of making that initial purchase. That's why I think the charging infrastructure piece, once they're purchased too, has to play part of that, and that's what the infrastructure strategy is going to look at. But really ramping up that discounting from 25 grand up to 120 grand for some of these vehicles, I think is going to make a really practical difference for people. And if you can get one HGV and kind of demonstrate the ability of that to save you money over the long term, as we've said in regard to the electric vehicle space, it's spotting the early movers and the benefits it can bring that kind of incentivises adoption more broadly because of the resilience benefits that it can provide.
The only other thing I'd mention is we're also running a thing called the Zero Emission HGV and Infrastructure Demonstrator Programme, which is £200 million worth of funding to put in place to basically get that evidence on the heaviest HGVs and whether they can be electrified. So that's going to put over 300 HGVs on the roads with over 300 charging points as well, because I think with the logistics sector, if you can make the numbers add up, then the transition will just happen. We don't have to worry with all the emotional baggage you get with cars. It should just be a numbers game. So getting the data out in the public domain should really help drive that, which is why we have this sort of three-pronged approach of the supply through the regulation, demand through the grants, and infrastructure through things like the depot charging grant. And the depot charging grant is what's interesting about that is we did a pilot last year, and there's huge amounts of demand for doing more in this space. Lots of companies want to do more. They just want infrastructure help. They've got plans to buy more vans and plans to buy more HGVs, and they have electricity available. They've checked that as well. So it's quite interesting that you can electrify some of these depots. You just need a bit of a push.
And just on that depot charging scheme, it's obviously been welcomed, as you say, but witnesses to this inquiry have raised that there's a short application window, meaning that the scheme was prohibitive for most organisations to create business cases, they told us. Will opportunities to apply be opened again in the future? And is there a way that you're thinking of to make sure that this scheme is accessible to all businesses and less restrictive, especially for SMEs with limited resources?
Answer that. The pilot was run in quite a short time to gather some data, so there was quite a restricted window, but the funding for the new scheme is multi-year. So the answer to your question is yes, there'll be multiple opportunities for companies to bid, and it's aimed at being open to all sorts of companies. There's a maximum grant value to ensure that the funding isn't just swollen or taken by big fleets. So SMEs should feel free to apply.
Okay, and Alex?
We just did HGVs. Can you tell me about coaches in the same space.
I mean, so it's something of a Cinderella of transport mode coaches, I think, and traditionally quite difficult to electrify, but often the technology is the same as HGVs. And you are seeing, I think there's a London to Cardiff electrified coach service. I'm pretty sure there's definitely a coach service in Scotland. There are some school coaches which are electrified as well, and that's because my kids went to school on one. So it is happening. There is issues around the infrastructure, there's issues around the availability of the models. All the models at the moment, there's no domestically produced zero-emission coaches. So as demand ramps up, we expect supply to ramp up to meet it. And what's interesting is trying to work out what the infrastructure offer has to be to enable that to work and how government can help to make it work. One of the key, I think, takeaways and the work we're doing on infrastructure strategy for trucks and coaches is that you shouldn't just assume that how they currently refuel diesel vehicles is how they will refuel zero-emission vehicles. So we need to be quite open-minded about that, I think.
On the depot charging scheme, in answer to a written question, Minister, you told me that 3 of the 92 projects were to do with coaches. Do you think we need to have a bit of a more targeted approach to coaches, therefore?
I think that's a very fair challenge, and certainly one that I'll take away, also reflecting on the inherent complexity of ensuring that the charging network suits our coach sector, which I think was an interesting thing that you managed to sort of tease out of the previous witnesses, where it's not, as you said, with freight and logistics, kind of point-to-point or even last-mile services. These are variable routes that these companies often run, and also the role of SMEs within the mix, I think, is particularly acute, actually, in certain parts of the coach sector, especially in areas like ours. So that's certainly something I will take away and reflect on. Absolutely.
And at the smaller level, minibuses, I gather there's an issue around minibuses becoming EV minibuses takes them over a particular weight limit, and that's creating challenges for particularly community transport operators and other operators that use minibuses rather than coaches or buses.
We should take that away.
Yes, okay.
There's an issue with vans, which I think we've fixed. There's an issue on the weight limit for vans.
Yes, I think it might be the same issue.
Yeah, that should come into force in June, I think. But we'll check it applies to minibuses.
Yeah, and I think for the capacity of a particular vehicle, if it becomes an EV, it takes it over a weight limit and into another tax bracket. So is a department looking at that?
Yeah, well, just in terms of those regulatory changes, they're focused through the department's lens currently on simplifying MOT testing and driver's hours rules, where the electric equivalent of the same thing, which would be used as a petrol vehicle, you have more onerous regulations. Those changes are coming into force, but in writing to you, I'll set out what we're doing more broadly in that space.
If you could, it's important to those sectors.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Thank you very much. I think that's been a really useful session today. Thank you very much for your evidence and the time you've taken to prepare and to come today. And if there's anything else you'd like to cover or expand on, please do feel free to write to us. We're now going to reflect on the evidence we've heard today and our previous sessions and the written evidence we've had, and then we'll consider what recommendations we may wish to make to government. So that concludes today's session.